Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere dimly lit, a little damp, and absolutely reeking of boiled cabbage. You're standing in a medieval cookhouse, and trust me, it's not as quaint as you might picture. The wooden beams are blackened with soot. The hearth spits greasy smoke into your eyes. Somewhere in the shadows, a dog is gnawing on what might have once been a goose foot, or possibly someone's discarded shoe. It's hard to tell. This is food medieval style, and you brave time traveller are about to eat it. You duck under a hanging carcass, possibly pig, possibly something else, and wipe your hands on your tunic, though frankly, that just makes them worse. The cook shoves a ladle your way with a grunt. You peer into the pot. The contents are grey, lumpy, and moving slightly. You ask what it is. She replies yes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you are right now. I love seeing where you all are listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You scoop up a bowl full of, let's call it stew. It has the consistency of porridge and the taste of damp wood. You nod politely, as if your tongue isn't weeping. The cook smiles with one tooth. Welcome to dinner in the Middle Ages. Hope you weren't expecting Michelin stars. The first shocker here isn't that the food is bad, it's that anyone survived it. Kitchens are more like open bonfires surrounded by chaos. Fire safety, never heard of her. A big pot is always on bubbling with scraps, bones, vegetables, and yesterday's dinner. Sometimes the same pot is kept going for weeks. There's even a name for it in some places, perpetual stew. Sounds cozy until you realise there's no real cleaning between rounds. You're basically eating history with a side of bacteria. Now let's talk hygiene. Your chef likely hasn't bathed in a week. The cutting board. It's just a wooden slab shared by everyone, including the butcher, the baker, and the cat who likes to nap on it. The floor is covered in straw meant to soak up things. Though what it mostly does is mask the smell of spilled ale and pig guts. Your average medieval kitchen is also not a quiet place. People are shouting over each other. Dogs bark constantly, and small children are either underfoot or actively trying to catch rats. Everyone is sweating because the hearth is hot and the walls are sealed tight to keep the warmth in and all the air out. It's basically a sauna, but with less eucalyptus and more rotting turnips. Still hungry? What's wild is that this is actually one of the more advanced kitchens. Maybe you're in a manor or the home of a prosperous merchant. If you were lower on the social ladder, and let's face it, you probably are, your kitchen is just a fire pit and a pot suspended by a chain. No chimney, just a hole in the roof to let the smoke out. Your eyes sting constantly, and your only seasoning is ash. Historians still argue whether medieval cooks were truly as careless as records make them seem, or if modern accounts exaggerate for drama. But most agree that by today's standards, even the best-run kitchen was a danger zone. Let's not even get started on pests. Mice are everywhere. Some people just shrug and call it extra meat. Others try elaborate traps involving bucket string and tiny ladders, none of which work. A fringe recipe from a 14th century manuscript suggests burying garlic cloves to drive rodents away. It's not effective, but at least the house smells better. Now you might be wondering, if the food was so bad, why didn't they cook something else? The answer is painfully simple. Options were limited. Most people lived on what they grew, which meant a diet of bread, porridge and legumes. Meat was rare unless you were wealthy, or lived near a forest where poaching was an option, though that came with the risk of, execution. You glance down at your bowl. There's something floating in it. Is it a herb? A leaf, a bug? No one cares. You stir it back under with your spoon and take another bite. It doesn't help. To be fair, not all the food was atrocious. Some of it was just aggressively bland. Salt was valuable, and spices were practically gold. A dash of pepper could double the cost of a meal. So most cooking relied on herbs like parsley, sage, or if you were really feeling fancy lovage. If you don't know what lovage is, you're in good company. No one did then either. And then there's the meat situation. Even when you could get some, it wasn't exactly fresh. Medieval preservation methods included salting smoking, or just letting it hang until the smell made your eyes water. If it got too funky, cooks simply boiled it into oblivion and added vinegar, hoping no one would notice. They noticed. One scholarly debate that still rages is about whether medieval people were aware of foodborne illness in the way we are. Some argue they knew more than we give them credit for. They understood spoiled food could make you sick even if they didn't know about bacteria. Others think most people just assumed illness came from bad, air-angry spirits or moral weakness. A few genuinely believed food turned bad because it had imbalanced humours. You meanwhile are just trying not to think about it as you chew something both crunchy and slimy. To wash it down, you get a cup of weak ale. It's warm, a little sour and suspiciously chewy. Water is only consumed by the brave or the desperate. Even in towns with wells, contamination is constant. If it's not filled with waste runoff, it's shared with animals. You recall seeing a horse relieve itself disturbingly close to a public fountain earlier. Now you're drinking with new caution. Still, life goes on. People adapt. They eat what they can, how they can, and celebrate the rare moments when it actually tastes decent. There's even joy in it sometimes. Families gather around the hearth. Stories are told. Bread is broken. Laughter rises over the clatter of wooden bowls. Food might be terrible, but it's also a ritual, a daily act of survival shared one ladle at a time. You lean back stomach fuller than you expected. Maybe that stew wasn't so bad after all, or maybe your taste buds have just given up. Either way, you're still here. You made it through dinner. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where every meal is a gamble, and every kitchen is a medieval episode of a cooking show hosted by chaos. And you haven't even reached dessert yet. You're still licking a suspicious bit of something from your molars when the next course is handed to you not by a waiter, but by a guy in muddy boots and a tunic so greasy it's reflective. He drops a slab of meat and a chunk of bread onto a wooden board. No plate, no napkin, no fork. Actually, where are the forks? You glance around. Everyone's eating with their hands ripping bread-pinching bits of meat-scooping stew with fingers. One man has a small knife he uses like a fork, stabbing morsels and popping them straight into his mouth. The woman beside him just tears at a chicken leg like a medieval velociraptor. Welcome to the world before table settings. Forks technically exist, sure. The Byzantines used them, and even a few Italians had them by the 11th century. But here in your cozy, smoky corner of Northern Europe, people see forks the way we might see a diamond-encrusted soup ladle, unnecessary and probably satanic. In fact, some church leaders did condemn forks when they first appeared too dainty, too fancy, too pointy. Food, they said, should be eaten the way God intended, with your hands and a sense of guilt. So you try it. You pick up the meat, cold, stringy taste like boiled leather. You gnaw anyway, pretending you're enjoying it. The bread is hard enough to double as a weapon. It's called a trencher, and it's not just food, it's your plate. Diners eat from these dense, flat loaves, then either toss them to beggars afterward, or let them soak up sauce for reuse. Your trencher is absorbing juices like a stale sponge, and honestly, that's the best flavour it's had all night. Of course, all this hand-eating comes with complications. Medieval manners are more, let's say, fluid than fixed. People wipe their fingers on their clothes or sometimes each other. You notice a man discreetly scraping stew from his beard into his bowl. Another scratches his head, then grabs a shared cheese round. You try not to retch. Historians still argue whether these unhygienic practices were as universal as records suggest. Some say cleanliness was a bigger concern than we think etiquette manuals do exist, instructing nobles to wash hands before and after eating. Others argue that manuals existed precisely because people were terrible at following them, a fringe belief from the time held that washing too often could weaken the body. So some people skipped washing entirely unless they were trying to impress someone or avoid marrying off a daughter. As for soap, it existed, but it was made from animal fat and ash, which left your hands smelling like both. Nice. You're given a spoon next to a wooden one that's more of a suggestion than a utensil. Soup dribbles down the side as you try to slurp politely. Across the table, someone drinks straight from the bowl. A child next to him dunks a fist in it. You've stopped expecting rules. And yet somehow there's a system here. There are unspoken hierarchies. Where you sit matters. Who eats first matters. If you're a guest of honor, you get the best cuts. If you're not, you get neckbone stew and a smile. Nobles have tasters, people whose whole job is to eat bites first in case someone slipped in a little arsenic. You do not have a taster, you are the taster. And don't forget about sharing. Most meals are communal, which means you're dipping into a shared pot with strangers. You try to avoid eye contact as someone double dips. It doesn't help. To lighten the mood, someone cracks a joke about an innkeeper whose soup was so thin he served it with a sieve. You laugh. Mostly because it hurts less than crying. Still, even in this flavor wasteland, you catch glimpses of creativity. A woman at the end of the table is making something with apples and honey. It smells almost pleasant. She's spicing it with cloves, rare, expensive, possibly hoarded from last year's feast. The scent cuts through the room's cabbage funk, like a candle in a bog. You make a mental note, befriend the apple woman. She clearly knows what she's doing. Your meal continues a slow parade of lukewarm stews, stringy meats, and overcooked peas. Between bites, people chat about crop yields, gossip about a neighbor who claims his goose laid a golden egg spoiler it didn't, and grumble about taxes. That part hasn't changed much. As the meal winds down, the table is a battlefield of crumbs, bones, and drips. Someone belches a long, proud sound. A few people cheer. You smile faintly, not sure whether to join in or offer congratulations. Burping, by the way, is not rude. In some places, it's considered a compliment to the cook. Other places, it's just gas. Either way, you're impressed by the volume. You start to help clean up, but your host waves you off and starts tossing bones to the dogs. The floor is now a smorgasbord for every roaming animal in the house, and there are many. Chickens peck at crumbs. A pig noses under the table. One cat has taken up residence in your lap. You are now a chair. This level of informality is typical. Animals in the house aren't unusual. In fact, in winter, they're often brought inside for warmth. You try to remember the last time you ate in a place that smelled like both soup and barnyard. Hopefully never. One scholarly theory even suggests that the presence of animals at meals reinforced the social order, reminding everyone that no matter how bad things got, at least you weren't the one being served. You stand, stretch, and accidentally knock over a jug of ale. No one minds. The straw on the floor will soak it up. Maybe. Eventually. A boy hands you a rag that's clearly seen centuries of service. You wipe your hands, then realize they feel dirtier than before. You smile and thank him anyway. When in Rome, or in this case, a hamlet near Durham, as you exit the hall, your stomach is full, but your standards are not. Still, you've survived another meal. That counts for something. You step out into the cool air and inhale deeply, finally away from the wall of steam and sweat. The stars are out. An owl hoots. In the distance, someone is probably still gnawing on their trencher. You laugh softly to yourself. You've just eaten a medieval dinner with your hands no napkin, no fork, and minimal trauma. That's more than most tourists can say. The stars are still hanging quietly above you as you amble away from the cookhouse. Belly-heavy teeth, slightly gritty, and fingers somehow stickier than they were an hour ago. You're hoping for something, anything to cleanse the palate. Perhaps a bit of dessert, a piece of fruit, a mint leaf. Honestly, you'd settle for a toothbrush and divine intervention. Instead, someone offers you a medieval sweet, a small, shriveled date stuffed with almond paste and rolled in something that may or may not be sugar. You pop it in your mouth. It's surprisingly decent, chewy sweet and a little crunchy. Is that sand? Could be. You smile anyway. Sweetness is rare and you take what you can get. But this little treat is a luxury. Most people, especially the peasantry, end their meals not with dessert, but with silence. Or maybe a second helping of gruel if they're lucky. The idea of a dessert course doesn't exist yet. That's a much later invention. Here, sugar is exotic and precious, brought in tiny quantities along trade routes from faraway lands. If you see it, it's in small amounts carefully hoarded by the wealthy or used medicinally rather than culinarily. Speaking of medicine, medieval people actually believed sugar had healing properties. Some apothecaries used it in salves and tonics. Sweetness wasn't just a flavor, it was a health boost, kind of like how modern smoothies are somehow both dessert and immune support. Historians still debate whether medieval medical recipes were genuinely effective or just excuses to sneak more sugar into the diet. Some think the line between medicine and candy was entirely blurred. Others argue people knew exactly what they were doing getting their sweet fix under the guise of virtue. Of course, if you weren't rich enough for sugar, there was always honey. Sticky golden harvested by hand, often at the risk of angry bees. Monasteries kept bees and some villages maintained communal hives. Honey was used in pies, cakes and drinks, though usually in moderation. You didn't drizzle it over everything like some kind of ancient influencer. You used it sparingly, reverently, like a flavor that might actually smile back if you treated it kindly. Back in the feasting hall, or what passes for it, things are winding down. People stretch, burp and shuffle off to wherever they sleep. You stay behind, curious about how food was stored. After all, if today's stew tasted like a swamp, you shudder to think how leftovers are handled. And here's where things get darker than your bowl of bean paste. Without refrigeration, medieval people had to get creative with preservation. Salting, drying, pickling and smoking were the most common methods. Salted meat was basically a dietary staple. It was hard, dry, and required soaking before it was edible, unless you liked your beef jerky with the texture of granite. Pickling was used for vegetables and even fish. You pass a barrel labelled something that looks like sour eels, and decide not to investigate further. But hey, it worked. Pickled food lasted through long winters and lean harvests, which made it essential. You might not enjoy it, but you wouldn't starve either. Drying herbs, fruits, and sometimes even cheese was common. People strung up strips of meat or apples near the hearth, letting smoke and heat do their work. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. And yes, there were accidents, mold rot infestations, but that was just part of the culinary lottery. Historians still argue whether spoilage was as rampant as modern people assume. Some claim medieval cooks were savvy and knew how to spot trouble. Others say people built up stomachs of steel and just powered through bad bites. One fringe theory suggests that tasting everything, including slightly questionable meat, was seen as a brave act of culinary courage. Or maybe just desperation. And then there's fermentation. Ah yes, fermentation, medieval Europe's best accidental invention. Ale, cider mead, and sometimes even fermented bread drinks like kvass were all part of the daily menu. Not because people were constantly drunk, although some were, but because these drinks were safer than water. Fermentation killed off enough bacteria to make the liquid at least less lethal. In fact, even kids drank small beer, a weak ale with low alcohol content, just to stay hydrated. You imagine yourself offering a tankard to a child in a sippy cup. The medieval version of a juice box. But the real treasure of the medieval pantry is what you're shown next. Your guide, a wiry man with eyebrows that could double as nesting material, leads you to a dark corner of the kitchen. He lifts a damp cloth to reveal a hunk of cheese. The smell hits you first, pungent, aggressive, slightly sweaty. You flinch. He beams. This is medieval cheese, often homemade, aged in cool cellars or caves. Texture varies wildly. Some are soft and mouldy, others hard enough to chip a tooth. Flavor ranges from nutty to this might be alive. People loved it. And honestly, once your nose adjusts, it's not bad. They also had butter, although only in certain regions. In some parts of medieval Europe, butter was a luxury more common in the north than the south. Southern Europe leaned on olive oil instead. You take a bite of rye bread with a smear of what you're told is butter, though it spreads more like clay and smells faintly of goat, but you chew anyway. You're starting to develop a taste for this chaos. For dessert drinks, if you were really lucky, there was hypocras, a sweetened wine spiced with cinnamon, ginger, or galangal. It was filtered through cloth and served warm at banquets. You won't be tasting it tonight, but your host describes it like it's the nectar of the gods. You nod, trying not to look jealous. He has one bottle. He's saving it for his wedding. Or a funeral. Whichever comes first. And speaking of wine, yes, it existed, but mostly for the upper classes. Nobles had access to better vineyards and imports from France, Italy, or Spain. The lower classes, they drank whatever fermented fruit juice they could scrape together. Some recipes included crab apples and brambles. You try to imagine crabapple rosé at a modern bar. It would probably cost $14 and come with a sprig of something ironic. You ask about chocolate. Your guide laughs until he wheezes. No chocolate here, friend. That delight won't reach Europe until after the Columbian Exchange, hundreds of years in the future. Same with tomatoes, potatoes, and corn. Entire categories of flavor just don't exist yet. Which means, yes, you are trapped in a world without fries, ketchup tacos, or chocolate cake. You consider crying. But then your guide pulls one last treat from under a cloth. A small, flaky pie filled with minced fruit nuts and suet. It's greasy. It's sweet. It's warm. And it's delicious. Finally something worth writing home about. You close your eyes, take a bite, and for a second it almost feels like dessert. You're still savoring the memory of that sticky warm pie, your first true culinary win of the entire medieval experience, when a low bell tolls in the distance. A sign perhaps that the kitchen is officially closed. Not that it mattered much. The remaining food is already being fed to animals or tossed into compost, which in this time is really just a glorified pile behind the stables. You decide to walk it off, stretch your legs, let the smell of boiled onion and smoked cheese clear from your nostrils. But as you meander past the edge of the village, something hits you. It's eerily dark. No glowing shop signs, no streetlights. Just the occasional flicker of a candle through thick wooden shutters. You've entered the true medieval world now, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is refrigerated. Which brings us to the next horror food freshness, or rather the complete lack thereof. If you thought those stringy bits of beef at dinner were suspect, you were right to be concerned. Meat, unless freshly slaughtered, often teetered on the edge of edibility. Without cold storage, the time between butchered and questionable was roughly the span of a decent nap. So how did they cope? Spices, glorious, expensive, sometimes eye-wateringly pungent spices. You stumble into a modest kitchen pantry and are instantly hit with a bouquet of clove pepper mustard seed and something that might be nutmeg, or it might be powdered turnip, pretending to be nutmeg. It's hard to tell. But the scent is overwhelming in the best way, like your nose just got slapped by the Silk Road. Back then, spices weren't just about flavor, they were survival tools. Cover the scent of going off meat. Mask the taste of yesterday's stew reheated for the third time. Add a bit of heat to dishes with no real concept of hot sauce. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves were treasured like gold. In fact, sometimes they were traded like gold ounce for ounce. Historians still argue whether spices were mainly used to disguise spoilage, or simply because they were considered status symbols. Some scholars insist that the nobility used spices not to mask bad food, but to flaunt wealth, because let's face it, if you can afford saffron in 1347, you're not exactly nibbling mouldy herring. Others believe spices were practical, first, prestige second. Either way, they were everywhere. And sometimes they were straight up fake. Medieval spice fraud was real. Ground up nutshells passed as pepper. Coloured powders imitated rare ingredients. Merchants stretched their stock with fillers. You imagine the medieval equivalent of a Yelp review. Tasted like oak sawdust, 1 star. But the demand didn't stop. Even the average household might stretch its budget for a tiny pouch of dried herbs. Not for everyday use, more like how you might keep a single scented candle in a bathroom, as a form of quiet optimism. Your host, spotting your interest, offers you a sniff of his special mix. It smells like cardamom and ambition. He says he only uses it once a year, feast days, or when the priest drops by unannounced. It's hidden behind a brick in the fireplace, right next to a withered sprig of rosemary and an old tooth. You smile and pretend not to see the tooth. Now, while spices were imported luxuries, herbs were the local heroes. Mint parsley, sage, dill and thyme grew in cottage gardens, monastery plots and wild fields. They were used fresh or dried in everything from stews to poultices to weirdly bed linens. Because yes, people would stuff mattresses with sweet herbs to counteract the not-so-sweet scent of sleeping in a shared room with 10 other people who had never met a deodorant. Herbs also had medicinal purposes. Your aching stomach from that salted eel stew. Here, chew some fennel. Feeling faint from the turnip fumes. Sniff some lavender. Want to ward off plague? Try a garlic garland. No guarantees, but hey, your breath alone could clear a room which might be just as effective. This is where things get a bit mystical. Food and medicine weren't separate categories. What you ate was considered part of your overall health plan in that vague horoscope reading way. The idea of balancing humours dominated medical thought: blood phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Foods were classified by their effects on these bodily fluids. Roast lamb might be hot and moist, while lentils could be cold and dry. It was basically astrology for digestion. And yes, there were charts. Giant, confusing, colour-coded charts. Physicians consulted them to decide whether you needed more pomegranate or fewer leeks. They didn't always work. You still got scurvy. But you got scurvy with style. Historians still puzzle over how widespread these ideas were among commoners. Some argue that peasants stuck to what they could grow and didn't bother balancing bile. Others say these beliefs trickled down from monasteries and noble households, eventually becoming a kind of folk logic. After all, who wouldn't avoid cabbage if someone told them it would make their spleen angry? You keep moving. The path is rough-lined with rocks and puddles that have not been filtered, purified, or turned into a carbonated lemon beverage. You glance into a trough of water where a pig is currently having its evening soak. You decide not to ask where the household gets its drinking supply. Water in general was risky. Rivers doubled as waste dumps. Wells were contaminated by livestock. Even clear-looking water could carry disease. So people drank beer. Weak beer, but still alcoholic enough to kill a few bugs. You recall that sippy cup beer from earlier and now understand why kids had such strong opinions about it. In wealthier homes, wine was an option, but again, it was rarely served plain. Watered down, spiced up, or sweetened with honey wine was a canvas for creativity and occasionally for hiding flaws. A slightly turned barrel adds cinnamon. Problem solved. And then there was posset a bizarre cross between drink and dessert. Warm milk curdled with ale or wine flavoured with spices and often thickened with bread. It was served to the sick, the elderly, and anyone foolish enough to say, "I'm craving something creamy and alcoholic." You hear of a noblewoman who swore by it for her insomnia. You try to imagine falling asleep to the sounds of your stomach negotiating with curdled wine milk. Bold. You wander past a cottage garden. By moonlight you spot rows of herbs hanging gourds and something that might be cabbage or might be a rock wearing a leaf. You don't investigate, but it's clear that even small plots could produce powerful flavours. Suddenly you miss your spice rack, your real one, back home, the one with paprika and chili flakes and turmeric that you bought because it looked Instagrammable. You swore you'd cook more. You didn't. But here in the middle of the 14th century, spice is survival. It's wealth. It's medicine. It's alchemy in powdered form. And somehow it all makes sense. Food isn't just fuel. It's a dance between rot and preservation blandness, and bravado hunger and hope. You brush past a rosemary bush and catch its scent. It's sharp, fresh, clean. For a moment, you forget the fish stew and the pickled radish and the questionable butter. You think of bread rubbed with rosemary and olive oil. You think of soup that doesn't try to fight you. You think of flavour not just as taste but as memory, a way to feel safe, human, full, and then you trip over a root and land in a puddle. So maybe not too full. You wring the damp from your tunic, which now smells like wet soil pig runoff, and a faint whisper of despair. But don't worry, no one else around you smells much better. In fact, the village aroma at large is something of a pungent potpourri wood smoke sweat cabbage and whatever's fermenting behind someone's shed. Scent is just part of the atmosphere now. You breathe through your mouth and carry on. There's a communal oven up ahead, still glowing faintly from today's baking frenzy. And that reminds you bread. Surely the bread here is decent, right? You approach the low stone dome with reverence. Inside, embers still pulse like sleepy dragon breath. A woman in a soot-dusted apron is scraping the last of the flat loaves from the hot stones. You take a seat on an overturned bucket and watch as she wraps one in cloth and tucks it under her arm like a newborn. It's strangely beautiful. This is pain quotidian, quite literally daily bread, the core of the medieval diet. And not just for peasants. Bread is everyone's business. Rich or poor, feast or famine, there's always some kind of baked grain thing on the table. It's as essential as Wi-Fi, but with fewer service outages. But don't expect a perfect baguette. Most medieval bread is coarse, dark, and dense enough to use as a blunt weapon. You try a piece of what's been offered to you, a hunk of rye that fights back with every chew. It's a workout and a snack. Still, there's comfort in it. Earthy, tangible, honest. You can almost taste the field it came from. The grains used rye, barley, oats, or if you're truly fortunate, wheat varied based on geography and status. Peasants leaned heavily on rye and barley, while wheat was saved for the wealthy. In fact, fine white bread, known as manchet, was such a status symbol that lords often served it as proof of superiority. A slice of white bread that was medieval VIP access. Historians still debate how nutritious these breads were. Some argue that darker loaves, though denser, were actually healthier, packed with more fibre and nutrients. Others point out that grinding methods were so crude, the flour often contained bits of stone or grit from the millstones. So yes, you might get a little extra crunch with your crust, courtesy of accidental dental sabotage. And here's a twist: bread wasn't just food. It was also used as tableware. Enter the trencher, a thick, stale hunk of bread used as a plate. After the meal, it could be eaten, given to the poor, or fed to the dogs. You imagine offering someone a chewy sourdough bowl instead of a ceramic dish. It's sustainable. It's kinda genius. It's also soggy and sad if your stew gets overly enthusiastic. Your guide, always eager, pulls a trencher from a bin and holds it up. 2 weeks old, he says, proudly knocking on it like a piece of firewood. You decline politely and return to your smouldering seat by the oven. But it wasn't all rustic and noble. Bread fraud was real and rampant. Bakers sometimes padded out flour with chalk ground beans, or brace yourself, ground up bones. No, not artisan hipster bones. Just plain old, we needed filler bones. Regulations were occasionally enforced, but with limited success. Bread was life, and sometimes life was gritty. You peek into a flour sack. It smells musty, but clean. The miller arrives weekly, assuming the weather holds and the river isn't frozen or full of sheep. Milling is a big deal. Watermills and windmills churn endlessly when available. Some regions even tax their villagers to use the Lord's mill. You can't just DIY your flour in private. That would be rebellious, or even illegal. And let's not forget the oddities like horse bread. No, not made of horses, thank goodness, but made for horses. It was a dense mix of bran and legumes, sometimes consumed by desperate humans during famines. Imagine the lowest carb, highest fibre protein bar imaginable. Then imagine it got left in the rain for 3 days. That's horse bread. Still, in times of shortage, beggars couldn't be choosers. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 wiped out crops across Europe. Rain fell endlessly. Grain rotted in the fields. People boiled grass bark and shoe leather. Bread became a memory. Even the most stubborn trencher was prized. Those who survived remembered it like a collective trauma, one that redefined how food was valued. Your guide tells you one old tale, a local story passed down through generations of a baker who smuggled flour during a famine by hiding it in hollowed-out firewood. He baked loaves in secret by night, feeding hungry neighbours one crust at a time. Was it true? Was it legend? Historians still argue whether such smuggling was common folklore or real defiance against feudal control. Either way, it's a good story. You wish you had some sourdough to go with it. You lean against the oven wall and let the warmth sink into your shoulders. The crackling embers, the scent of singed wheat, the faint rustle of wind through thatched rooftops. It's oddly soothing. Almost like home, if your home had rats the size of bread loaves and no concept of personal space. But here's a little-known fact: bread was also tied to social justice. Local officials called ale conners and bread weighers roamed markets to check the size and weight of loaves. Bakers caught short-changing customers could be fined or even publicly shamed. One punishment involved a pillory where guilty vendors had their heads and hands locked in a wooden frame while onlookers threw stale crusts, or turnips, or insults. Fair trade medieval style. You wonder aloud what kind of bread the nobles ate at court. Your guide puffs out his chest and describes the buttery white rolls served with venison and mulled wine. Served warm, flaky, dusted with flour. You imagine them like soft pillows made of dreams. But he's never tasted one. He just heard someone describe it once 12 winters ago, and while the bread of the wealthy was tender and fine, it came with baggage. Literally. Wheat had to be hauled from afar, sieved several times, and baked in private ovens by trained cooks. Not exactly farm to table. More like power to plate. Meanwhile, the average village bread, though tough, held communities together. Baked, communally shared during festivals, and broken between friends and strangers alike, it was the glue of medieval life. Tough, sometimes sour, often uneven, but always there. Kind of like your oldest, crustiest sweatshirt. You're offered another slice before bed. This one's oat-based with a crackled top and faint sweetness from honey. You chew thoughtfully, your jaw slowly forgiving you. It's not bad. In fact, it might be the best thing you've eaten since arriving. And then someone hands you a bowl of curdled milk soup to go with it. You stare at it for a moment, smile weakly, and take a bite of bread instead. The moon hangs heavy, now half shrouded in cloud, like a sleepy eye peeking through a wool blanket. Somewhere behind the houses, a dog barks at absolutely nothing, because even the dogs in medieval times are on edge. You shuffle away from the warmth of the communal oven, fingers sticky with bread crust, and you find yourself on a narrow path that curves toward the manor. Tonight, it's time to crash the fancy dinner party. You are not on the guest list, but that won't stop you. As you approach the manor hall, you hear it before you see it. Laughter, the clatter of wooden cups, a lute that's mostly in tune. Candlelight flickers through stained glass windows, and for a moment, you could almost believe you're outside a cozy tavern in a fantasy film, except this is real and nobody's drinking butterbeer. They're drinking something way weirder. A servant ushers you in with barely a glance. You've bathed in the last week, and your clothes are less than 3 layers of filth, so apparently that's good enough for the backbench. Welcome to the world of elite medieval feasting, where everything is performative, even the gravy. The hall is huge, its ceiling lost in shadows. Long wooden tables stretch across the room, like runways for roast birds. At the far end sits the lord of the manor, perched on a dais, with the most white bread, the biggest knife, and the fewest actual responsibilities. His goblet is gold. His belt buckle could anchor a boat. And his dinner is a play. Food here is more than food. It's power. It's theatre. It's peacock. Yes, peacock. Roasted, dyed bright blue or green, and sometimes redressed in its own feathers to look alive again. Imagine serving your dinner like a taxidermy project with a crispy finish. That's what elite medieval cuisine was all about. Not just eating extravagantly, but eating visually. You didn't just feed your guests, you wowed them. You pass a side table stacked with what looks like meat pastries shaped like castles. There are pies moulded into swans' jellies the size of hats, and a tower made entirely of sugared almonds. One bored-looking boy is using a breadstick to jab at a quivering jellyfish of aspic. It wobbles ominously. The table is a minefield of medieval bravado. But underneath the spectacle, The food isn't always that tasty. Rich dishes are often overcooked, overspiced, and weirdly slimy. Imagine eating a hot smoothie made of rabbit raisins and clove. Welcome to the world of blancmange, a classic upper-class dish that sounds French and elegant, but is essentially chicken mush mixed with almond milk and sugar. Yes, it's savoury chicken pudding. Yes, they served it proudly. Historians still argue whether nobles actually enjoyed these dishes or merely pretended to out of sheer social pressure. Some records suggest the same dishes were recycled from banquet to banquet, strategically half-eaten, then refashioned into new courses. Others argue that noble palates were so accustomed to excess that subtle flavour was lost on them. After all, when you eat gilded porcupine with saffron sauce, a humble apple might taste like poverty. And then there's the ritual of it all. Before anything is eaten, there's a whole procession. A steward announces the courses. A cupbearer tastes the Lord's wine to prove it's not poisoned, of course. Servants parade through with dishes raised high, often preceded by minstrels playing somewhat coordinated tunes. Food arrives like a royal baby, heralded, examined, and eventually served to someone who didn't cook it and won't clean up after. You back on your bench are served something less majestic. Possibly lamb, possibly eel. Hard to tell in this light. It's swimming in a sauce so heavily spiced, it smells like someone spilled perfume into stew. You take a bite. It's hot, oddly sweet, and aggressively wet. A noble near the dais tosses a bone casually to the floor. You watch as a servant sweeps it into a basket, along with half a roll and a mostly full goblet. Food waste here is staggering. Not because they don't appreciate it, because they can. Excess is the language of wealth. And nothing says power like throwing away a roast pheasant because you didn't like the garnish. You hear whispers of dishes, even stranger eels arranged to look like snakes roasted beavers, because they were considered part fish, and therefore allowed during Lent, and pies that no joke released live birds when cut open. You imagine the chaos. The feathers. The smell. That wasn't just a nursery rhyme, that was dinner theatre. You're handed a tiny plate of comfit sugar-coated seeds that crunch like gravel and taste like baked perfume. These are dessert, apparently, or at least a signal that dessert is coming. You nod politely and stash them in your sleeve for later investigation. Sugar, by the way, is an elite import at this point. The people in this room consume more in a week than an entire village might see in a year. It's used to preserve fruit candy nuts and make elaborate sculptures. You eye a small tower of sugar shaped like a lion, its mane tinted red with beet juice. It looks mildly terrifying. Someone's probably going to eat that. But here's the thing. Even the elites can't escape certain problems. For all their cooks and resources, food poisoning is still a very real threat. Improper storage, tainted meat, and creative seasoning combinations mean even the wealthiest bellies occasionally revolt. One noble once described a feast as a procession of ailments in silver dishes. You chuckle, and then immediately worry about your own stomach. Historians still argue whether the food culture among the nobility encouraged health or hastened death. Some scholars point to the prevalence of gout, aka the king's disease, linked to rich meats and wines. Others suggest that food rituals helped protect elites from famine and disease by reinforcing cleanliness and order. After all, you're less likely to get sick from stew if 3 people have tasted it before you. A servant refills your cup with something sharp and fruity. You raise it in a small, respectful toast to medieval excess, to glittering aspic, to the glorious weirdness of eating peacock like it's just a chicken with better marketing. The music changes. The courses begin to slow. Trays are removed. Hands are wiped on shared cloths no napkins yet remember. People stretch and laugh. One knight is trying to balance a spoon on his nose. A lady fans herself dramatically, possibly from wine, possibly from boredom. And you, tucked near the end of the table, take another bite of whatever that was. It's grown on you. Not because it tastes great, but because here in this candlelit theatre of food and power, you finally get it. Medieval meals weren't about comfort. They were about statement. To eat like a noble was to perform nobility, even if the pudding had chicken in it. Your belly is uncomfortably full now, but in that vague, suspicious way where you can't quite tell if it's satisfaction or the beginning of a regrettable evening. You ease away from the noble hall with a grateful nod, your fingers sticky with honeyed glaze, and your mind spinning with the image of that feathered peacock roast. If you didn't just dream it, you might never believe it happened. Outside, the night air is cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of herbs burning tallow and animal sweat. Somewhere to the east, a donkey brays like it's narrating a tragedy. You follow a winding path away from the manor past low stone cottages, where windows flicker with soft lamplight. Here's where you'll find the real magic of medieval food, the herbs, the gardens, and the quiet miracle of making something halfway decent out of what little you've got. This is the herbalist's corner of the village, and in many ways the medieval version of a farmer's market, crossed with an alchemist's shed. You step cautiously toward the small garden surrounded by woven wattle fencing, where rows of curious plants grow in tight, fragrant clusters. Lavender, rosemary, marjoram, and thyme all thriving under the care of someone who knows how to use every stem and root. You kneel beside a squat bush of sage and crush a leaf between your fingers. The scent rises warmly calming like a kitchen on a good day. This is where flavor begins for the everyday cook. Not with meat, not even with salt, but with herbs, tiny earthy explosions of taste and medicine bundled into one leafy miracle. In fact, flavor in medieval food often came from necessity, not artistry. When your meat is a little off, and it often was a handful of crushed garlic or mint could save the day, and your stomach. You'd be amazed how often spice blends doubled as both culinary and medicinal rescue missions. A sprinkle of hyssop here, a pinch of pennyroyal there, it's less a recipe, more a gamble. Historians still argue whether medieval cooks truly understood the chemical properties of herbs, or if their knowledge was based more on tradition and superstition. Many herbs were passed down in handwritten recipes, or more often remembered by grandmothers who measured with intuition and sharp glances rather than spoons. Tonight you're invited to one such kitchen. Inside a small timber-framed home, a woman in a linen gown tends a bubbling cauldron over an open hearth. Her sleeves are rolled to the elbows and she's gently crushing seeds with a mortar and pestle that looks older than time. The room smells alive, rich with onion leek and something spicy you can't quite place. You duck your head and sit near the fire, basking in the low, steady rhythm of domestic alchemy. She hands you a bowl. You brace yourself. But it's good. Like, actually good. A stew of beans, cabbage and herbs thickened with barley and kissed with vinegar. Nothing fancy, but balanced, satisfying. You want another bite before you finish the first. Turns out herbs weren't just flavor tools, they were the lifeblood of a cuisine, with no refrigeration inconsistent meat, and a very casual relationship with hygiene. Garlic was prized not only for its taste, but its supposed power to protect against illness. Sage was used to cleanse and aid digestion. Even parsley, humble, unassuming parsley, was brewed into teas for stomach cramps. And speaking of taste salt, if herbs were the quiet heroes of medieval kitchens, salt was the megastar. Not just for flavor, but for preservation. Without it, you couldn't smoke meat, cure fish, or keep butter from going rogue. Entire economies were built around salt production. Towns grew near salt mines, like medieval startup hubs. In fact, the word salary itself comes from the Latin salarium, a soldier's allowance for buying salt. You can't help but wonder, how did ordinary people get their hands on it? Well, they usually didn't. Salt was expensive, and the good stuff, fine white crystals, was reserved for nobles. Peasants made do with coarse, dark, often gritty salt scraped from drying pans or traded through salt fairs. Sometimes they used salted herbs pickles or vinegars to get around it. Because let's be honest, everything tastes better when it's a little bit salty and sour. You glance toward the shelves above the hearth, where bundles of dried plants hang in tidy rows. Some you recognize: fennel bay leaves dill. Others are stranger, small purple pods, curling bits of root, a bundle labelled simply wormwood. You do not ask questions. You sip your stew. And then there's mustard. Yes, mustard. the medieval underdog of condiments. Not the yellow stuff from a squeeze bottle, but ground seeds mixed with vinegar wine or verjuice, that's unripe grape juice, by the way. It was a staple at nearly every level of society. Cheap to make easy to store and powerful enough to hide the fact that your fish has been dead for a week too long. You try a spoonful from a wooden bowl. It hits your tongue with a sharp punch, almost nose-clearing. No wonder they loved it. Mustard was the wasabi of its day. But medieval flavour wasn't just savoury. Sweetness too was cherished, especially when paired with spices. Picture this, a chicken pie seasoned with cinnamon and sugar, lamb roasted with cloves and honey. It's strange to modern tastes, but entirely normal here. The line between savoury and sweet was blurred, and often the more bizarre the flavour combination, the more sophisticated it was considered. Historians still puzzle over this obsession with spice-sugar combos. Was it due to trade where rare Eastern spices and cane sugar were used as edible status symbols? Or was it just a phase like when everyone in the 90s wanted bacon on their donuts? Either way, your tongue adjusts gradually, accepting that meat can taste like dessert and vinegar can taste like relief. You ask about cinnamon ginger and nutmeg and your host laughs. Those you'd have to know someone who knows a sailor. She says, tossing in a handful of something green instead. The kitchen walls creak with wind. The fire dims to embers. You lean back and let your eyes trace the rafters overhead while your belly settles into a state of cautious gratitude. And just when you think you've tasted it, she brings out the preserved stuff. Pickled turnips, fermented leeks, apples stored in straw, and what might be the world's oldest sauerkraut. These were the lifelines of winter. No grocery runs, no emergency Uber Eats. Just jars and crocks sealed tight and buried in the cool earth. Everything smelled a little like vinegar and history. You sip a mug of mead, the sweet, heady drink made from fermented honey, and feel it warm your ribs. It tastes like ancient cheer. Like a recipe someone invented on a whim and kept making because it turned out people really, really liked it. And you realize something for all the talk of how bad medieval food was. It's not all disaster stew and bone loaf. At least not when someone knew what they were doing. When a careful hand seasoned a humble broth. When a patch of thyme grew wild behind the cottage. When pickled onions kept you going through February. It wasn't about luxury, it was about survival with flavour. You finish the last of your stew brush crumbs from your tunic and offer thanks to your host. She nods wordlessly and returns to the hearth, already prepping tomorrow's meal, her fingers dancing among the herbs like a sleepy sorceress. Outside, the wind has quieted. The moon hangs lower now, and the village hums with the kind of hush that only comes after a full belly and a long day. You walk slowly, the scent of rosemary still clinging to your sleeves, and wonder what tomorrow's dinner might bring. Hopefully, not fish pudding. Your steps lead you farther from the herb-scented calm of the cottage, and into the darker folds of the village where meals aren't shared at polished tables or beside crackling hearths, but outdoors beneath makeshift shelters in weather that doesn't care whether your soup has enough turnip. This is where you really start to feel it. The difference. The distance between the spectacle of noble feasting and the scraping together of peasant survival. Here, food isn't about expression or status. It's about staying warm and upright through another week. You pass a thatched lean-to where a group of children sit huddled around a bowl picking at something indistinct. You can't tell if it's stew porridge or yesterday's experiment. You smell cabbage. You always smell cabbage. Tonight you'll be dining with the poorest of the poor. The field hands, the travelling labourers, the ones who have never tasted sugar, never smelled saffron, and wouldn't know what to do with a roast peacock, even if it wandered into their yard and begged to be flambéed. Someone hands you a wooden trencher, basically a bowl carved out of yesterday's loaf, and into it goes a ladleful of something. It's greyish, a bit lumpy. Steam curls lazily into the cold air. You stir it and find bits of onion oat, maybe wild greens, and a chunk that might be mushroom, or might not. Welcome to pottage. It is the unsung hero of medieval food. The great equalizer. The thing you eat because it fills you up, not because you're composing a TikTok reel of your lunch. And yet there's something quietly noble about it. This one-pot wonder that changes with the season, the available forage, and the mood of whoever's stirring. Pottage was the medieval version of what's in the fridge. Only the fridge was a field, and the leftovers were a small miracle. Historians still debate whether pottage varied dramatically across regions, or whether it was essentially the same everywhere, hot, humble, and perpetually underseasoned. Some accounts suggest richer households would add meat or eggs to bulk it out, while the very poor relied entirely on grains and greens. You spoon a bite into your mouth. It's not bad. It's not great either, but it's warm, filling. And given that you've seen some medieval kitchens store meat by hanging it in the rafters and praying to St. Botolph, this feels like a culinary win. Nearby, a young boy explains the art of gathering leftover crops. After harvest, usually grain heads or dropped beans. It's technically legal as long as you're not caught. Entire meals are built on what's left behind. Root vegetables stolen from frostbitten soil herbs that escape the Lord's eye, or a squirrel too slow for its own good. Foraging becomes a necessary skill, not just for berries or nuts, but for edible weeds. You listen as a grandmother points out sorrel dandelion leaves and nettles free food growing in plain sight. It's a little like a medieval Whole Foods, if Whole Foods also gave you rashes and a stomachache when you guessed wrong. And yes, sometimes the protein was experimental. Frogs, hedgehogs, birds too small to roast, but just big enough to not die hungry. One traveller tells you about a stew made entirely of snails and herbs. Another reminisces fondly about roasted crow. You nod politely and tighten your grip on your oat porridge. Historians still argue whether these survival foods were common or exaggerated in records. Some insist they were rare and only eaten during times of true famine. Others believe they were more common than anyone likes to admit, just not recorded, because who brags about their rat stew? Even water wasn't guaranteed. Clean drinking water was a luxury most peasants couldn't depend on. Instead, they turned to weak ale small beer with just enough alcohol to kill bacteria, but not enough to get you tipsy. Imagine a beverage that tastes like flat, watery bread. Now imagine that's all you can drink, all day, every day. You take a cautious sip from a shared jug and try not to grimace. Someone claps you on the back approvingly. But once in a while, just once in a while, there's a celebration. The village gathers for a wedding or a saint's feast day, and suddenly food transforms. It's still humble, but there's effort. Flatbreads cooked on hot stones, turnips roasted until sweet, wild apples crushed into rough cider, music played on cracked fiddles, laughter even if it's missing a few teeth. Tonight you get lucky. Someone produces a pigeon. It's been stewing all day in a pot seasoned with garlic dried herbs, and what might be the last bit of bacon fat in the house. It smells divine, like hope and salt, and things you didn't think could exist in the same pot. The meat is dark and rich, and for a second, you feel guilty for enjoying it so much. Because this isn't dinner, it's treasure, the kind of meal people tell stories about. Remember when the Thompsons caught that pigeon? Oh yeah, we ate real that night. You notice that every part of the pigeon gets used. Bones for broth. Giblets diced into the stew. Even the feet are boiled for added thickness. Waste isn't just discouraged, it's absurd. You don't throw away calories when you live on the brink of hunger. A child hands you a chunk of rye bread hard enough to deflect arrows. You dip it in your stew and chew slowly. It tastes like effort, like grinding and baking and the long, patient labor of survival. There's something deeply human about it. By the flickering firelight, a man with a stained tunic tells the story of his cousin, who once cooked plague porridge, a blend of barley, gooseberries, and anything not actively rotting. You ask if he survived. The man shrugs. Long enough. And there it is. This is where food stops being cuisine and becomes resilience. It's not about taste, not even nourishment. It's about grit. About finding enough calories to carry a load of firewood tomorrow. About feeding 5 children with 1 leek and a prayer. You wipe your trencher clean with the last of your bread. Someone passes around a sweet, an actual sweet. It's a candy made of honey and crushed seeds hardened into a jagged shard. It cuts your tongue a little, but it tastes like joy. Not just sugar, celebration. A reminder that even the poorest kitchens had their moments of light. As the fire dies down and the night deepens, you sit quietly warmed not just by food, but by the stories that come with it. Recipes passed by word of mouth, tricks learned by trial and error, meals that were more memory than menu. And maybe that's what makes it all matter. In a world where food could be bland, strange, or barely edible, the act of making it, sharing it, became the culture, the connection, the ritual, even if it sometimes involved hedgehog stew. The fire has burned low behind you, casting lazy orange glows across the edges of the village as you wander toward a darker corner, away from the cottages, away from the smells of cabbage and wet wool. You cross a patch of uneven ground boots, crunching frost-stiffened grass, and follow the sound of water lapping against stone. A river, thin and winding, and beside it a cluster of weathered huts, fishers' homes. They smell like the sea despite being miles inland, and everything about them is coated in a fine, ghostly dusting of salt and scale. You pause. You listen. The night is quieter here, broken only by the occasional splash, or the slow creak of a wooden dock shifting under its own weight. Here's the next lesson in your medieval culinary journey. Fish was everywhere, and not always by choice. See, back then the church had a say in what you ate, and it said no meat on nearly half the days of the year. That's right. Between fasting days, feast days, saints' days, Lent, Advent, and Wednesdays and Fridays, meat from land animals was often off limits. That meant no bacon, no beef, no duck. Unless it swam, or was considered sufficiently wet and squishy, it didn't qualify. Which brings us to the unsung hero/victim of the medieval diet, the fish. You step inside a fisherman's hut ducking beneath dried nets and racks of split eels. It smells like a shipwreck, and something about the smell sticks to the roof of your mouth. But you're welcomed in with a nod, and soon you're seated beside a fire pit, where a small fish, tiny, practically transparent, is being grilled over open flame. It's called a whitebait, and you're told it's best eaten whole. Bones, head, eyeballs, the works. You chew slowly. It tastes of smoke salt and stubbornness. Historians still debate whether medieval people actually liked fish or merely tolerated it. Some accounts describe elaborate fish dishes at noble tables, sturgeon in almond sauce, baked pike wrapped in herbs, while others paint a picture of peasants choking down river eels and dried herring with forced piety and lots of mustard. Tonight you'll sample both. You're invited to the riverbank where 3 men are gutting the day's catch. Their knives are crude but fast, and in moments a bucket fills with gleaming scales and fish parts. One of the men gestures to a wooden box beside him inside rows of preserved fish wrapped in cloth and packed in coarse salt. This is stockfish. It's cod-dried until it becomes as hard as a ceiling beam and about as appetizing. Before you eat it, you have to soak it, then beat it, then boil it, then flavor it with anything, to remind yourself it's technically food. A young girl offers you a flake of the rehydrated stuff, now floating in a weak onion broth. It's chewy, not unpleasant. But if rubber bands had a flavor, it might be this. Still, it fills the belly, and you understand why it was so valued. Stockfish was imported, traded, hoarded. It lasted forever, and if you had enough of it, you could ride out bad winters, bad harvests, or ecclesiastical fasts without falling into full famine. Even kings stocked stockfish. They just got to soak it in wine instead of cabbage water. Then comes the eel. Eel was the Swiss Army knife of medieval protein. Easy to catch, easy to preserve, and considered technically okay by church standards. It was smoked, boiled, fried, jellied, even baked into pies. You're handed a small wooden plate with a sliver of smoked eel on it. It glistens darkly in the firelight and you hesitate. It tastes better than it looks. Fatty, rich, almost like fish bacon. You nod approvingly. Someone claps you on the back. There's an old superstition passed around the fire eels bring luck if eaten whole spine and all on the night of a full moon. You make a mental note not to be around during the next full moon. Despite the sheer quantity of fish in the diet, you notice something missing flavor. Most of the fish you've tried tonight tastes like fish and salt. That's it. If you're lucky, a bit of pepper or vinegar. The richer families, those with access to trade routes, could transform fish with exotic spices, almond milk sauces, and imported citrus. But here in the fisherman's world, survival trumps seasoning. Historians still argue whether these bland preparations were deliberate or simply a lack of resources. After all, how exciting can you make a dried herring when your entire pantry consists of oats, turnips, and a single clove of garlic? As the fire burns lower, someone shares a pot of fish porridge. Yes, porridge. Barley cooked in fish stock with chunks of dried herring and a garnish of parsley. It sounds worse than it tastes, but not by much. And then something rare, a baked fish pie. The crust is made from rye flour, coarse and tough, but baked golden around the edges. Inside it's a mix of perch and leeks, thickened with ground almonds and brightened with a splash of vinegar. It's genuinely good. Not just edible, but tasty in a strange, tangy way. You ask how often they eat like this. The answer is simple: only when the catch is kind. You lean back, belly full of various aquatic sacrifices, and take a long sip of ale. Not the fancy kind. This one tastes like fermented oats with a hint of despair, but it chases the fishy aftertaste from your tongue. By now the sky has gone deep indigo. The stars have sharpened above, cold and unwavering. The wind off the river has picked up, carrying the scent of wet wood reeds and something faintly metallic. You pull your cloak tighter and stare at the reflections dancing across the water. It hits you again how different this world is. No supermarkets, no sushi bars, no late-night grilled cheese, just what you can catch preserve trade or beg. And yet you can't help but admire it. Not the flavour, but the sheer gritty determination, the endless inventiveness, the knowledge passed from wrinkled hands to eager ones from tide to tide. You stand and stretch bones creaking like old dockboards. The fisherman nods as you leave. You nod back silently, promising to remember the eel, the whitebait, and the pie that almost made you forget it was fish. You walk upriver, letting the moonlight guide you, wondering what new questionable delicacy tomorrow will bring. Hopefully something without eyes. You're walking now through fog. Not the dramatic, swirling, haunted moor kind, but the thick, clinging kind that smells like soot and boiled onions. It settles in your hair coats. Your cloak softens the edges of the crooked buildings ahead. You wipe your sleeve across your face and keep going. Your boots splash through puddles as you step into the outskirts of a bustling medieval town. This is no sleepy village with cabbage plots and hedgehog stew. This place hums. You hear carts rattling metal, clanking, children shouting, dogs barking, and somewhere nearby, the unmistakable clang of a street cook's pan hitting stone. You've arrived at the medieval version of fast food. Street food, if you like, where the cooking's quick, the seasoning is luck of the draw and health codes. Well, let's just say no one's checking for hairnets. You round a corner and there it is, a food stall, or rather a wooden cart with a hole cut in the top, smoke curling from a blackened iron pot. The vendor barely looks up as he stirs something vaguely porridge adjacent. You lean in. The smell is earthy, sour and suspiciously meaty. It's probably not rat. You hope it's not rat. He ladles a steaming scoop into a crust of bread and hands it over. No cutlery, no napkin, just crust and guts and go. You take a bite. The bread is tough and yeasty, and the filling, some kind of offal hash, is aggressively seasoned with vinegar and pepper. It's hot, it's salty, it's oddly comforting. This is what most townsfolk ate on the go pies. Porridges, roasted animal bits, fried doughs, and whatever could be cooked fast and kept vaguely warm over embers. Remember, home kitchens weren't always usable. Chimneys were rare, firewood expensive, and smoke inhalation not exactly great for dinner conversation. So if you lived in a town, especially if you were a worker apprentice or someone without a proper hearth, you ate on the street. One vendor is hawking hand pies filled with mashed peas. Another shouts about lampreys don't ask. A third is selling skewers of something that might be pigeon. You eye it warily and move on. Historians still argue whether street food vendors catered mostly to the poor or to the upwardly mobile middle class. Some records suggest noblemen also grabbed a hot pie from time to time, especially during travel or hunting. Others claim the street fare was strictly for the hungry and harried the ones without kitchens, or kitchens without food. You pause beside a stall that smells like cinnamon, sweet in this economy. The vendor grins and hands you a fritter dough fried in lard dusted with sugar and filled with apples. You bite in. It's warm, crispy, actually delightful. And entirely thanks to trade routes that brought exotic spices like cinnamon, nutmeg and cloves all the way from the east. Of course you can afford this because you're a time-travelling dream ghost. The people around you can't. Spices were status symbols. A little cinnamon meant a lot of money or a very generous employer. Someone bumps into you and you drop the fritter. It splats into a puddle with medieval flair. You sigh and step back into the crowd, taking care not to step in anything unidentifiable. Here the streets are loud with market noise. A fishmonger is shouting about today's fresh catch, but you've had enough fish for one lifetime. Next to him, a baker sells day-old loaves at half price. They're so hard you could probably use one to fend off a boar. You wander deeper and find a tanner's shop. The smell hits you before you see it, animal hides, urine and something acrid that stings your eyes. Not food, definitely not food. But it makes you grateful for even the most questionable pies. Then another food stall. This one has a bubbling pot of something brown and chunky. You catch the words tripe and onion and make a polite retreat. The vendor shrugs and calls after you, it's better than it smells. You believe him. You just don't want to test that theory. As the day winds down, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifts through the streets. That's the nice thing about cities. Someone is always cooking something. Maybe it's edible, maybe it's not. But the odds of starvation go way down when every third alley is a surprise buffet. You pass a tavern now. The door swings open and laughter spills out along with the scent of spiced wine and roasted meat. Your stomach growls even after all those pies. Temptation wins. Inside, it's warm and loud. A fire roars at one end and the tables are packed with men and women drinking from heavy mugs and tearing bread with their hands. The tavern keeper eyes you nods, and soon you're seated with a trencher of thick stew and a mug of something frothy and barely alcoholic. The stew is richer than anything you've had in the village. There's real meat in it, probably pork or beef, and it's been cooked long enough to surrender. It melts on your tongue. There are root vegetables too and a hint of something sweet. Maybe prunes. It's delicious and rare. Not every tavern served food this good or at all. In some places a tavern was just a barrel of ale and a few stools. But here it's a proper meal, the kind a travelling merchant or lower noble might order when on the road. Historians still debate whether medieval taverns were welcoming communal hubs or rowdy dens of crime and bad soup. The truth, of course, is somewhere in between. Tonight it's comfort. It's heat and light and a belly full of stew. As the sky outside turns amber, the cook behind the counter starts preparing for tomorrow. You watch her boil bones into broth dice onions with a worn blade and rinse greens in a bucket. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. And you realise how much of this food, this entire era's cuisine, was built not on taste, but on timing, storage and scarcity. The stew is gone now. The mug is empty. Your breath smells like ale and garlic and onion, and honestly, you don't mind. You're full. You're warm. You've survived a day of medieval street dining without contracting anything that ends in pox. On your way out, someone offers you a candied almond. You pop it into your mouth. Sweet, spicy, a perfect fleeting luxury. It lingers on your tongue as you step back into the fog. The food here may not be Instagrammable. It may not be kind to your intestines, but in its own strange, greasy, spicy way, it tells a story. Of people who endured, who shared, who fried questionable meats and sold them for a penny so someone else could face the day with just a bit more hope. You turn your collar up against the chill and disappear back into the noise. You wake up with your back against a barn wall, the scent of hay, and the distant clatter of hooves in the air. Someone's donkey has been protesting for the last hour, and a rooster with no concept of personal space just strutted past your feet. Welcome to the rural morning rush medieval style. Your stomach rumbles again. After a day of fish pies and might be pigeon, you're ready to find out what a real medieval breakfast looked like. Spoiler, it's not eggs Benedict or avocado toast. You roll to your feet, brush straw off your cloak, and follow the aroma of something warm and bready. It leads you to a low stone cottage where the door hangs open and a woman hums softly as she stirs a thick pot. She doesn't seem surprised to see you. Maybe time travelers are common here. Inside, it's cozy, if smoky. A clay hearth glows at the far end, with a blackened kettle suspended above it. You sit cross-legged on the floor and peer into the pot. It's a pale, creamy slurry flecked with something brown. Pottage, she says, for breaking fast. You've heard the word before. Pottage is the Swiss Army knife of medieval meals, breakfast, lunch, or dinner it'll do. It's a simple stew of grains, usually oats or barley mixed with whatever's on hand. Beans, herbs, onions, maybe a scrap of bacon if the family's lucky. Today's batch smells surprisingly nutty. You're handed a wooden bowl and a stubby spoon. The first bite is not bad. It's bland, sure, but warm and filling with little pops of flavour from the occasional herb and a hint of dried apple. Kind of like savoury oatmeal with commitment issues. Breakfast for most people in the Middle Ages wasn't a big deal. In fact, it was often skipped entirely. The church frowned on eating too early, seeing it as gluttonous. Morning meals were for labourers, children, and the sick, those who needed the energy. Everyone else was expected to tough it out until midday. Historians still argue whether this was actual spiritual discipline or just a way to ration the food supply when winter got serious. But here in this home, breakfast isn't about indulgence. It's about getting ready to survive the day. You're invited outside, where the rest of the family is tending to chores. Chickens scatter underfoot. A boy hauls a pail of water from the well while his sister collects eggs. You notice the small vegetable plot out back, cabbage leeks, turnips, maybe a few peas. These are breakfast ingredients too. Not in the breakfast necessarily, but they'll fuel the fire that keeps the pot going. Nearby, a flat stone slab leans over the hearth like a makeshift griddle. A young woman is baking a kind of cake not sweet, but hearty. It's a manchit, or maybe a barley scone. She presses it flat and flips it with practiced speed. The smell is nutty, almost toasty. You're handed a piece, and it burns your fingers through the crust. You blow on it and take a cautious bite. It's simple, dense, chewy, but deeply satisfying, especially with a smear of what might be soft cheese. You try not to wonder what animal it came from. It's breakfast. Don't ask questions. Another local favourite ale. Not the boozy end of day kind, but a weak, cloudy brew called small ale. It's safer than water, mild enough for kids and packed with calories. You're handed a clay cup and sip carefully. It tastes like watered-down oatmeal tea. Not exciting, but it keeps you from dying of dysentery. So there's that. Some mornings when the harvest has been good breakfast might include preserved meats or dried fruit, a bit of smoked ham, a sliver of salted herring, a dab of honey on your bread. But those are rare mornings. Most days it's grain water and hope, and yet something about it works. You feel grounded, steady, like this slow, humble start gives you just enough fuel to face a day filled with muck mud and medieval nonsense. You wander into a nearby barn where a farmer is tending his oxen. He pauses to take a bite of something wrapped in cloth. You lean in cheese, hard as wood. He breaks off a corner and shares it. It tastes like the inside of an old boot soaked in vinegar. You chew anyway. It's protein, it's calories, and it's surprisingly common on farms where milk from sheep, goats and cows is turned into cheese as a way to keep it from spoiling. Back outside, someone's grinding grain with a hand quern. It's a 2-stone setup, primitive but effective. You help turn the upper stone, and soon coarse flour spills into a basin. This flour will be baked into bread, of course, but not the soft, fluffy kind you're used to. No, this is black bread, made with rye or barley dense as a brick and twice as dangerous. If you dropped it from a window, you could kill a chicken. You sample a slice torn straight from a cooling loaf. It's chewy, sour, slightly smoky from the hearth, and frankly, it grows on you. especially with a bit of onion or a dunk in warm broth. Then there's gruel. Oh, gruel. The word alone conjures orphanages and Dickensian despair. But in the Middle Ages, gruel was a real breakfast staple, thin oat porridge, sometimes flavoured with honey or herbs if you were lucky. You watch as a mother pours some into a wooden bowl for her toddler. It steams gently in the cool air, and the kid gulps it down with sticky enthusiasm. You take a taste. It's like oat-flavoured water with texture. Not great, not terrible, just food. You begin to notice a pattern. Medieval breakfasts weren't about pleasure. They were about practicality. Warm, soft, digestible food that could be made in bulk, eaten fast and kept simple. The flavours came second if they came at all, but the ritual that mattered, because this meal, as humble as it was, marked the start of labour. It was a line between sleep and toil, between rest and responsibility. It meant the fire was still burning, that there was enough left in the pantry to go another day. You sit back and look around. The fog has lifted. The sun is breaking through pale and hazy over the fields. A rooster crows again late to the party and someone laughs. You stretch stomach full, mouth dry, heart weirdly content. The day has begun, and you've had your breakfast. Kind of. The sun's climbing, but not in any particular hurry. A warm haze rests over the thatched rooftops as you wander out of the village and along a well-worn road. Birds chirp from the hedgerows, and somewhere nearby, a donkey brays like it's just discovered its own voice. Again, your feet crunch over gravel, and you find yourself headed toward one of the great constants of medieval life, the manor. Not a castle, not quite, more like the local seat of power. Here lives the lord or lady who owns the land, and by extension, everything that grows, breathes, or complains on it. Today you've managed to score a spot in the manor kitchen. Not as a guest, of course. You're shadowing the cooks, and what a strange, smoky, frantic world they inhabit. You duck through a low doorway into chaos. Picture a room the size of a small barn, its walls blackened from years of open flame. The air is thick with wood smoke and meat grease, and someone is shouting about eels. The cook, an imposing woman with arms like firewood bundles, waves you toward the hearth. You obey instinctively, cautious of anything that involves boiling fat and medieval discipline. On the spit today, a goose. Not just any goose, one stuffed with herbs, nuts, and something that might be raisins. It's rotating, slowly dripping fat into a pan that hisses and smokes. A scullion ladle bastes it every few minutes, eyes wide with the fear of undercooking dinner for nobility. At a side table, two women are pounding something in a mortar. You lean in. Almonds. They're making almond milk, not the trendy barista kind, but the medieval staple used in everything from sauces to stews. Especially handy during Lent when dairy was forbidden, and the church had a lot of opinions about what you put in your mouth. Historians still argue whether this religious dietary micromanagement was spiritual guidance, or just a really elaborate excuse for culinary experimentation. You grab a wooden spoon and stir a pot of blancmange, a gooey mess of shredded chicken rice, and the aforementioned almond milk. It looks like a medieval risotto and smells faintly like a fancy hotel lobby. Not bad, honestly. Someone shouts, and a tray of comfit spiced nuts rolled in sugar topples to the floor. The kitchen freezes. A pause. Then a sigh. Then frantic sweeping and the cook muttering about wasting good sugar. You learn quickly, sugar is gold. Imported, expensive, and only for the rich. When used, it's often paired with spices like saffron, ginger, or cloves to create lavish dishes that blur the line between savoury and sweet. Today's menu includes a fish pie shaped like a castle meatballs glazed with honey, and something the cook proudly calls hedgehog. It is not mercifully an actual hedgehog. It's minced pork moulded into an adorable critter shape and bristled with almonds to resemble quills. You're allowed to taste one. It's salty tender and unexpectedly charming until you crunch into an almond spine and nearly lose a tooth. Meanwhile, a boy is plucking a dozen tiny bird's quails, or maybe larks destined for a decorative dish that will probably be more about show than sustenance. You remember the poor villagers with their cabbage stew and rye bread, and suddenly feel a little guilty. These meals, after all, are performances. Feasts in the manor hall aren't just about nourishment, they're political theatre, a display of wealth control and divine favour. The more exotic the ingredient, the more absurd the presentation, the more power it communicates. Take the peacock being prepared at the far end. Yes, peacock. It's already been cooked, its skin carefully removed, and later you're told it'll be sewn back on raw and posed like it's alive. A glittering, unsettling centerpiece meant to wow the guests. Spoiler, it'll be tough as leather. But that's not the point. The point is drama. The point is, look what I can afford to waste. Still, it's not all glitz. You see practical dishes too, boiled greens, herb and barley soups, hearty pasties stuffed with root vegetables and spiced meats. There's even a bucket of pickled onions, possibly the only constant across all social classes. You sit near the hearth and nibble a leftover crust dipped in gravy. It's deeply spiced complex with hints of cinnamon and maybe even rosewater. A strange mix of the familiar and the foreign, like a medieval version of mole sauce without the chocolate. A page enters calling for the first course. Platters are lifted, sauces stirred birds arranged on beds of kale like edible flower beds. The kitchen erupts into a blur of motion, and you dodge out of the way just as someone rushes past with a tray balanced on one shoulder and a pigeon-shaped pastry on the other. You sneak into the hall behind them. Inside, the Lord sits at the high table, flanked by guests with embroidered sleeves and too many rings. Servants pour wine from ceramic jugs, and the smell of saffron and roast meat hangs heavy in the air. As dishes arrive, conversation flows, laughter rises, and everyone pretends not to notice the smoke staining the tapestries. You watch as someone tastes the blancmange, nods approvingly, and moves on to the meatballs. A plate of gilded quail legs circulates, followed by a jelly moulded into the shape of a castle. It wobbles ominously. No one dares cut it first. There's no real distinction between sweet and savoury here. Sugar, salt, vinegar, and spice are all jumbled together in the same dish. That's medieval cooking for you, bold, bright, and often bewildering. Historians still puzzle over the exact motivations behind this flavour mixing. Was it about preservation prestige, or did people just like weird food? You lean against the doorway and let the sounds of the feast wash over you. Clinking goblets, crackling fire, someone singing slightly off-key. This too is medieval life, not just toil and pottage, but spectacle and showmanship. Food as identity. Food as power. Eventually, the courses end. Fingers are wiped on linen. Jesters tell jokes that haven't aged well. And in the kitchen, the cook finally sits wiping sweat from her brow, muttering about the next feast already looming on the horizon. You help yourself to one last bite, a slice of bread with goat cheese and herbs, and slip quietly outside. The manor looms behind you, golden in the fading light. You walk down the hill, back toward the village belly full of almond-stuffed symbolism and salted flower sculpture. And you think it's not just what they ate, it's how they served it. How they told stories through food. How they performed wealth, endured famine, and occasionally made a hedgehog out of pork. You step off the road and into the twilight mouth, still tingling with ginger. You're walking again beneath a sky, slowly filling with stars, when the village disappears behind a bend in the path, and something altogether quieter replaces it. The trees rise thick and tall around you now, and the hum of human activity fades to the rustle of leaves and a lone owl calling out in the distance. The road leads to a small abbey, modest by medieval standards, but still impressive in its own way. Stone walls, arched doorways, and windows filled not with glass, but stretched parchment or thinly scraped horn to let in the light. You pause, breathe in deeply, and step inside, welcomed not by bustling cooks or boisterous nobles, but the smell of beeswax, cool stone, and the faintest trace of incense. Inside, the rhythm is different, slower, precise. Here, food isn't flamboyant or improvised. It's measured, scripted, and dictated almost entirely by the monastic rule. You're invited to join the monks for the evening meal, known simply as collation. And yes, this is where we get the modern word for light refreshment. Except here it's not about snacking between meetings, it's about simplicity and spiritual discipline. So you probably shouldn't ask about snacks. Dinner begins with silence. No idle chatter. No jokes about the fish. Instead, the brothers file in robes, brushing the stone floor, and take their places at a long, narrow table. One monk stands to read aloud from scripture or a saint's life while the others eat. It's part nourishment, part reflection. You chew and contemplate mortality at the same time. On the plate, a modest spread. Lentils cooked in vegetable broth. Dark bread, coarser than the Lord's manchet, but fresh and warm. A few wilted greens drizzled with vinegar. And for protein, possibly a hard-boiled egg or a wedge of cheese. If it's not a fast day, and here's the kicker, it's often a fast day. Historians still debate the actual percentage of days monks were supposed to fast. Some suggest up to half the calendar year involved dietary restrictions of one kind or another. That's a lot of boiled vegetables and almond milk soups. You can practically feel the cheese ration trembling under the weight of church doctrine. You take a bite of lentils and they're actually quite nice. Subtly seasoned, a hint of garlic, maybe a little parsley. Nothing fancy, but not joyless either. It's food designed to sustain, not seduce. And yet monasteries were famous for their kitchens. You've probably heard the legend, those monks brewing beer, making cheese-baking loaves you could survive a winter on. And it's true. Many monasteries had sophisticated food operations. They grew herbs in cloister gardens, brewed ale for both nourishment and commerce, and some even pioneered early preservation techniques. Why? Because the monastery was self-contained, a miniature world. Every task, from farming to cooking to copying books, was done within these walls. And when your kitchen is also your laboratory, things can get surprisingly advanced. You wander into the herbarium, a low-walled garden near the kitchen. The scent is rich with mint, thyme, sage, and wormwood. You spot a monk carefully harvesting lavender with a small sickle, while another kneels beside a row of leeks. This is food and medicine grown with intent and devotion. Inside the kitchen, you find something curious. Rows of clay jars filled with dried herbs, pulses, and roots. A mortar and pestle. A shallow pan crusted with what might have been honey-glazed turnip chips. You take a sniff, sweet, earthy, slightly burnt. Not bad. One pot simmers over the hearth. It smells faintly of cabbage and something floral. A young monk stirs it rhythmically, as if performing a liturgy. You learn it's a thick broth made from garden greens and chickpeas thickened with stale bread. You try a spoonful, gentle warming like a hug from a stoic uncle. And yes, sometimes the food gets fancy, especially during feasts. On holidays like Easter or the Feast of St. Benedict, the menu steps up. There might be a fruit tart sweetened with honey and spiced with cinnamon. Maybe even fish served in almond milk sauce or wafers stamped with religious symbols. But even then, the extravagance is muted. It's not about opulence, it's about order. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century and followed for generations, laid it out clearly: moderation in all things. Even joy. You're shown to the cellar, where the real treasure lies. Wheels of cheese, strings of dried herbs, barrels of ale brewed with yarrow and wild hops. A small miracle of medieval logistics. This isn't feasting, it's long-term survival with style. You help stack some firewood by the hearth and find yourself handed a treat. A small square of baked spelt cake made with nuts and dried figs. It's chewy and a little oily, but surprisingly satisfying. Monks didn't live in total austerity, they just balanced indulgence with restraint. And here's a twist. Monasteries often ate better than the average peasant. They had land labor and knowledge. They wrote the recipes, managed the stores, and preserved knowledge that would otherwise be lost. It's why medieval cookbooks sometimes begin with phrases like "as made by the monks at X Abbey." You're led back to the dining hall. The meal has ended. Wooden bowls are stacked, benches pushed in, and everyone files out, silent still, into the cloister walk. The setting sun filters through the arches in long gold streaks, and the air smells of lavender and smoke. One monk lingers near you and offers a final word softly sufficient. It is enough. And you realize it is. No banquet, no gilded peacock, just warmth, discipline, a hot bowl on a cold evening. Maybe a bit of honey when the abbey bees are generous. You watch them disappear into the twilight robes, fluttering like silent waves, and you follow the path away from the abbey, past the herb garden, and into the darkening woods. Night is falling, and the stars are starting to glitter one by one over the silent fields. You're full in a strange way, not just with food, but with calm, and possibly chickpeas. It's early morning again. The world is painted in grey mist and dew. Your boots squish in the wet grass as you move past hedgerows and twisted oaks, back toward the threadbare lanes of peasant life. But today, you're not headed for the stew pot or the smoky hearth. You're heading toward something more mysterious. The fair is in town. OK Town is generous. It's more like a loose assembly of stalls and awnings on the edge of a muddy village green. Chickens cluck freely underfoot, and someone is definitely trying to sell you a wooden spoon for the price of a chicken. The fair in medieval times was part market, part chaos, and very much part culinary free-for-all. The smells hit you first, roasting meat-boiled sweets and something alarmingly fried. Your stomach rumbles, which is strange considering all the almond-stuffed hedgehogs and lentil broths you've survived. But the fair is different. It's indulgent, temporary, and sometimes just plain weird. You drift toward a vendor turning a spit over an open flame. Not lamb, not chicken, not even goose. It's something called a brawn. Not to be confused with strength, it's actually a boiled pig's head chopped, mixed with herbs, cooled and pressed into a jelly. Sliced like lunch meat, served cold. And yes, it still has a bit of snout. You take a bite. Salty, fatty, oddly satisfying if you ignore the faint feeling that you're chewing on a dare. Nearby, a baker is hawking pasties, flaky crusts filled with whatever was available that morning. You try one. It's warm, peppery, and filled with minced beef and dried fruit. Apparently, that's normal. Sweet and savoury still haven't broken up in medieval cuisine. Historians still argue whether these unexpected ingredient combos were due to preservation fashion or sheer recklessness. Either way, it works mostly. You finish the pasty and consider another until your eyes land on something even stranger. A pie shaped like a fish with scales carved into the crust and raisins for eyes. You hesitate. It blinks. Okay, no, that's your imagination, hopefully. At the next stall, a woman offers you pottage on the go-yes medieval takeout. It's thicker than usual, ladled into a rough clay bowl and served with a stick of crusty bread. As you sip it, under a sagging awning, the rain starts to spit lightly from the sky. The soup warm, earthy, a little thin maybe, but with enough onion and barley to fill your belly. Across the way, a child gnaws on what looks like a candied root. You ask and learn it's sugar-coated fennel, sweet, herbal, crunchy. It's like a medieval lollipop if your parents were herbalists. And then there's the main event, the meat pie contest. Locals gather with steaming bundles of pastry, each hoping to win a copper coin, and the approval of the town reeve, who acts as judge taster and possibly executioner of flavour crimes. You sample a few, some are flaky and rich, others are just confused. One brave soul has attempted pigeon and plum. Another has gone all in on spiced beef with saffron. The winning pie, shockingly, is simple pork, an apple heavy on the pepper. You nod in respect. Medieval seasoning trends leaned hard on spice when they could afford it, pepper, cumin, ginger, and grains of paradise if you were really fancy. Of course, spice was expensive, imported, exotic. You'd need a merchant connection or a deep purse, which is why right next to the pie contest, there's a spice merchant with tiny cloth pouches of powder that cost more than a new shirt. You lean in, one sniff of cinnamon, and you're momentarily in Cairo, or so it feels. Clove mace, long pepper. These aren't just flavour, they're status. You buy a pinch with the last of your imaginary coin and pocket it for later, because if you ever end up back in the peasant village, that pinch might be worth more than gold. Back at the fair, a jug of warm ale is passed around. It's thick, a bit sour, and tastes vaguely of apples and old wood. You pretend to enjoy it. The brewer grins. You're part of the crowd now. Music drifts in a fiddler off-key, but enthusiastic. Children chase each other through puddles. Someone attempts a juggling act with turnips and drops one on your foot. It's okay. You've had worse injuries from medieval table knives. Lunch rolls into evening. A man grills flatbreads on a stone slab. He offers one slathered in soft cheese and wild garlic. You devour it like it's the only thing you've ever loved. Then there's a pot of what someone proudly calls fish pudding. You try a cautious spoonful. It's creamy, fishy, and aggressively bland. You don't finish it, but you admire the confidence. And here's where things get weirder. One tent boasts mock food, a medieval prank cuisine. Eggs made of marzipan. Fruit pies filled with meat. Loaves of bread shaped like human feet. You nibble a pear that turns out to be liver. Tricksy, gross, kind of brilliant. Historians still debate how common these jokes were. Some say they were for courtly entertainment. Others think they were part of carnival days when rules loosened, and even the food played tricks on you. Either way, your taste buds are now officially confused. As dusk settles in, bonfires crackle around the edges of the fair. Someone spits a chunk of roasted eel onto a plate for you. It's rubbery, oily, but not the worst thing you've eaten today. That title still belongs to the liver pair. You sit by the fire with a few villagers sharing a thick hunk of rye bread smeared with goose fat. It's humble, hearty, and perfect with the bitter ale you're still pretending to enjoy. Someone passes around dried apples threaded on string. Another hands you a bite of preserved plum soaked in vinegar and spiced with cloves. Sweet, sharp, and weirdly comforting. There's no fancy presentation here. No silver plates or carved bread sculptures. Just food hot, shareable, alive with the smells of earth fire and hands that have worked harder than yours. As the fair winds down and the last meat pies are boxed up for tomorrow's hangovers, you realise this might be your favourite meal yet. Not because it was the best tasting, but because it was loud, joyful, messy. This was food for the people, and the people knew how to live a little even with pickled fish. You rise, stretch, and head out of the fairground, the smell of roast pork and barley ale clinging to your tunic. Your pockets are lighter, your stomach is uncertain, but your heart strangely full. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows again, clearly confused about the time. You walk into the twilight wondering if your next meal will blink at you too. You wake in a hayloft again and brush straw from your face with the groggy grace of someone who spent the night dreaming about eel pies and sugar-coated fennel. A shaft of morning light slices through the slats above you. Your stomach grumbles in a language you don't understand, but it seems to be asking what now. Today you're not heading to the manor or the abbey or even the fair. You're going somewhere stranger, more refined, more theoretical. Today you're joining the cooks of a noble household. But not in the kitchen. No, you're headed to the study, because someone has to plan these feasts, record the recipes, and for the brave few, even write them down. Yes, believe it or not, medieval people wrote cookbooks. Not a lot of them, and certainly not for the average villager. But in wealthy courts and noble circles, culinary knowledge became a symbol of status, sophistication, and control. And some of these recipes, let's just say they make the fish pudding look tame. You arrive at a hall, not quite a castle, but definitely above peasant grade, with polished stone floors, iron chandeliers, and a resident cook who probably has more knives than friends. She greets you with a nod and a stained apron, then promptly ignores you. Respectable. You're handed a thick parchment manuscript, smudged, cramped, and clearly written by someone with more ink than patience. The script is uneven, the spelling creative, and there are no measurements, or temperatures, or cooking times. Just ingredients, order, and chaos. Welcome to the world of medieval recipe writing. The first entry: take good beef chop, it fine, add wine and saffron and stew it long until it be good. That's it. No mention of what good means. No quantities. Just vibes. You try to imagine following this today. Would it taste okay? Probably. Could you mess it up? Definitely. Would Gordon Ramsay scream absolutely? Historians still argue whether these recipes were practical guides or prestige projects. Were they written for use, or to flex literacy and wealth, maybe both? Some were copied into household books for the lady of the manor, others recorded by stewards, and a few, like the famous Formula of Curie, compiled by royal chefs. The form of curry assembled for King Richard II in the 14th century includes over 200 recipes, many with ingredients you've never heard of and techniques that read like culinary dares. There's a dish called mimonia, made with rice almond milk and shredded chicken spiced until you can't tell if it's dessert or dinner. Another calls for meatballs dyed green. Why? To look like frogs, maybe. Because nothing says luxury like amphibian confusion. You flip through the manuscript and find something intriguing, a pie filled with pears cheese and powdered ginger, wrapped in a crust tinted with saffron. The result? A golden, savoury sweet dessert that walks the line between genius and what were they thinking. But the pièce de résistance coquentresse, now brace yourself. This one's legendary. You take the front half of a piglet and sew it to the back half of a capon, a fat castrated rooster. Then you roast it, glaze it and serve it like a mythological creature, a culinary chimera. And yes, people ate this. Not often and not casually, but when it appeared on the table, everyone knew they were in the presence of serious food money. You glance at the notes scribbled beside the recipe. One says serve at Michelin, another warns do not overboil the wine sauce. There's even a doodle of what might be a chicken wearing a crown. Medieval marginalia, not always helpful, but often delightful. You flip back to the index though, calling it that is generous. It's more like assorted dishes in no clear order. There are recipes for almond milk, porridge stewed lampreys, rosewater custard, and a mysterious jelly called leech, made from boiled cow hooves, sugar and cream cut into little diamonds, and served chilled. Sounds fancy, feels like dessert, probably smells faintly of hooves. You pause on a recipe simply titled mortrus. Ground meat, breadcrumbs, egg yolks, spices. It's blended into a thick paste cooked down and served with coloured sauces. You've seen versions with meat sculpted into shapes birds, dragons, even towers. Because yes, food presentation mattered, especially at feasts. Meals were theatre, prestige, political signalling, and cooks were artists. Slightly terrifying artists, but still. You help copy a few recipes. The ink smells metallic, the quill scratches like a dry throat. Your fingers cramp before the second page. You develop deep respect for the anonymous scribes who wrote these things down, especially when they had to describe how to skin a peacock and redress it in its feathers after roasting. Yes, that was real. No, you don't want to do it. Outside the study, you're summoned to test one of the dishes in progress. It's a custard tart, golden and soft, flavoured with rosewater and topped with tiny candied fennel seeds. You take a bite. Creamy, floral and surprisingly modern. It's the kind of dessert you'd pay $14 for in a boutique cafe, and here it is from a 14th century recipe on lambskin parchment. Later, you're handed a bowl of frumenti cracked wheat boiled in almond milk, flavoured with saffron and honey. Sometimes served with venison. Tonight it's plain. Still, it warms your insides and makes your taste buds do a medieval little dance. The cook grunts in approval. Dinner wraps with hippocras, a spiced wine brewed with cinnamon, ginger and cloves, then strained through a cloth until clear. Sweet punchy, and definitely something your medieval aunt would sneak into her flask at church. You sit by the hearth full again and reflect on the madness and brilliance of this world of food and ink. Medieval cookbooks weren't just about feeding people. They were about recording prestige, mastering nature, and shaping culture, one terrifying rooster pig hybrid at a time. The flames crackle. A cat curls up beside you. Someone drops a mortar in the kitchen, and you hear a soft creative curse in Middle English. You smile. You might not survive here forever, but you'd eat well while trying. You wake with the faintest whiff of rosewater and ginger, still clinging to your breath tucked beneath a wool blanket in a guest room that smells like old herbs and damp stone. There's something oddly soothing about medieval luxury. The beds are lumpy, the windows are basically holes in the wall, and there's a draft that might qualify as a minor storm front, but the food occasionally divine. Today, though, you're not headed for any manor house or fairground. You've been invited to dinner in a setting less grand, but far more curious a monastery. Yes, you a weary traveller with questionable table manners are about to dine with monks. Silent monks in some cases. And their food. Well, let's just say the vibes are humble, the seasonings are minimal, and the wine flows more often than you'd think. The stone cloister is quiet as you enter. Everything echoes your boots, your stomach, your internal monologue, debating whether monks eat better than peasants. Spoiler, in some ways they do. The refectory. The dining hall is cool dim and lined with long wooden tables. A single candle flickers at each end. A few brothers nod as you pass, and one gently gestures for you to sit. You do, trying not to make your chair scrape like a collapsing drawbridge. The first course arrives with no fanfare, a bowl of thin broth with barley and leeks. You slurp cautiously. It's warm, modest, and surprisingly filling, though no part of your tongue is dancing. Here's the thing about monastery food, it's governed by rules. Specifically, the rule of St. Benedict, which laid out daily schedules, prayers, work duties, and yes, meals. Meat from four-legged animals was typically restricted, but fish, eggs, cheese, and legumes were fair game. Except during fasting seasons when things got more penitential. That said, medieval monks were clever. When the church banned meat, they sometimes counted beavers as fish, because they swam. Seriously. Historians still argue whether that was a theological loophole or just gourmet gymnastics. You spoon up the last of your broth and receive a slab of dark rye bread, hard crust, chewy interior. It's been dipped in a little olive oil, imported costly, but considered appropriate for monks. Butter would be too rich. Besides this, oil came from the abbey's sister house in Aquitaine. A little holy import-export. Next comes a dish of pulse-boiled peas with garlic herbs and maybe a splash of wine. This is monk comfort food, humble, protein-rich, and built to fuel long days of copying manuscripts and silently judging worldly folks. You chew slowly, your thoughts drifting. Life here is silent during meals. One monk reads scripture aloud from a pulpit today. It's something about humility and the fleeting nature of flesh. You resist the urge to glance at the legume mush and laugh. When dinner falls during a fast, monks get even more creative. Almond milk, already popular among the upper class, becomes essential. Used to make faux cream sauces, stews, even custards. Yes, dessert survived fasting. Tonight's dessert: a stewed apple sprinkled with cinnamon and sweetened with surprise honey. Sugar is expensive and often reserved for feast days, but honey is the real MVP of monastic sweetness. You bite in and immediately feel like a repentant noble. Sticky joy with a whiff of virtue. A monk sets down a small clay jug beside you. You glance. Wine. Definitely wine. This abbey, like many, makes its own. Monastic orders became experts at viticulture, tending vineyards, crushing grapes, storing barrels. They drank moderately, but regularly. Water wasn't always safe after all, and a little wine helped digestion. Or so they claimed. You take a cautious sip. It's sharp, earthy, and faintly smoky. Not the fruity stuff you'd find at a medieval court, but strong enough to turn prayer into poetry. And here's a fun tidbit. Medieval monks brewed beer too. Lots of it. They perfected brewing techniques, developed storage methods, and even regulated alcohol content. Some modern beer styles can trace their lineage directly to monastic recipes from this era. Yes, Trappist ales owe their complexity to centuries of brewing monks who believed even abstinence should be well fermented. You don't get beer tonight, too late in the day, but you hear it served during work hours, just enough to keep the edge off your vow of silence. You look down at your plate. A few grains of barley remain a trace of pulse, a smear of honey from your apple. The simplicity is humbling. This food isn't meant to impress. It's meant to nourish without vanity, to sustain without distraction. But don't be fooled. Behind the modest recipes lies a surprisingly sophisticated food culture. Monks wrote down gardening tips, preserved ancient Roman techniques, and traded seeds with other monasteries across Europe. They cultivated saffron, fennel, mint, mustard, and more. Their gardens were living spice cabinets. You slip outside after the meal. The air is cool and the herb garden is alive with movement. Bees hover a rabbit bolts, and the wind carries the scent of thyme and sage. Somewhere nearby, a monk trims lavender with sacred patience. A stone bench calls to you and you sit with a deep exhale. The stillness is striking. After all the feasts and fairs, the roasted capons and prank pears, this place feels intentional. Like every bite was measured not just in weight, but in purpose. You're joined by an older monk who passes you a handful of dried figs. He doesn't speak, but his eyes crinkle with silent amusement, as if to say, not all fasting is suffering. You chew thoughtfully. The figs are chewy, rich and sun-drenched. Each one tastes like memory. Some monks, you learn, would go to great lengths to maintain balance. Fasting wasn't starvation, it was rhythm. A way to reset, reflect and honour the sacred. The food may have been simple, but the intent behind it, anything but. Historians still debate whether monasteries truly avoided extravagance. Some records show lavish feasts on saints' days, complete with multiple courses and musical accompaniment. Others point to austere menus and daily frugality. The truth, as always, probably lived somewhere in between a turnip and a roast carp. You stand to stretch. The monk nods again and wanders back toward the cloister, disappearing into the shadow of the stone. As you wander toward the guest quarters, you pass the kitchens. A warm, yeasty scent wafts from the ovens, tomorrow's bread rising slowly, methodically. No rush, no fuss. Inside, a novice stirs a pot of lentils. Someone else slices onions by candlelight. It's quiet work, holy work, food as devotion. Back in your room, you settle onto the mattress stuffed with straw, and probably a few regrets. You listen to the distant sound of bells marking the last prayers of the day. Monastic food wasn't shocking. It wasn't theatrical, but it was deliberate. And in its quiet rhythm, it might be the most honest food you've tasted yet. You close your eyes. The fig sweetness lingers. Somewhere a loaf of barley bread rises in peace. You wake to the toll of bells again, faint, rhythmic and oddly comforting. It's still dark out, which feels wrong, but this is monastic life. The brothers are already at prayer somewhere in the chapel. You stretch, yawn like a medieval donkey and pull on your tunic. Today you're leaving the serene quiet of the abbey for somewhere more chaotic, more human and infinitely more fragrant. Not because of incense, but because you're about to explore the strange science of preserving medieval food. Let's be honest, nothing about this era involved refrigeration. No fridges, no freezers, no vacuum-sealed plastic bags. And yet people managed to store food across harsh winters, lean seasons, and long voyages. How well? You're about to find out. You follow the novice cook down a stone path behind the monastery and into a low building that smells like someone salted a fish, pickled a cabbage, smoked a pig, and then forgot about them for 6 months. Which, to be fair, is kind of what happened. This is the larder. It's dim, earthy, and impressively funky. Hanging from beams are sausages in varying stages of desiccation. Crooked shelves hold jars of preserved fruit, rows of dried herbs, and mysterious pottery sealed with wax. You brush past hanging strings of onions, garlic, and surprise dried eels. Because of course there are. A young monk hands you a sliver of smoked trout. You nibble. Salty, smoky, faintly pine-scented. It's good in that rugged backpacker kind of way. Preservation back then was more than convenience. It was survival. Winters in Europe could be brutal, and spring, the so-called hungry gap, often arrived before crops did. So people learned to dry salt smoke ferment and pickle just about everything that didn't run away first. Take salting, for example. Meat or fish would be packed in coarse salt, sometimes layered with herbs or spices, and stored in barrels or crocks. Salt was expensive, but critical. It didn't just slow spoilage, it also transformed flavour. Salted beef became a staple of long journeys. Salt cod was shipped all across Europe, from Norway to Spain, to inland towns that had never seen the ocean. Historians still argue whether medieval folks actually liked salt cod, or just tolerated it because they had no choice. You taste a chunk soaked in water and boiled with herbs. It's firm, a bit chewy, definitely not sushi, but hearty. Then there's pickling. Anything from cabbage to pears might end up submerged in vinegar brine or soured ale. Cabbage turns into something suspiciously like sauerkraut. Turnips mellow into tangy tangles. Even eggs got pickled. You imagine cracking one open after 3 weeks in vinegar, and your modern taste buds quietly whimper. Drying was also huge. Fruit laid out in the sun meat hung near hearths, mushrooms threaded like beads. Some were even candied boiled in honey until leathery. Think medieval fruit roll-ups, only stickier. You try a bite of dried apple from a basket. It's tough and sweet with a depth that tastes almost smoky. Not bad. Kinda like what you'd find in a bougie hiking snack pack. Minus the plastic. Smoking, of course, wasn't just for flavour, it was for preservation. Fish, fowl and hams hung above smouldering fires for days. The resulting flavour was bold savoury and sometimes aggressively woody. You try a sliver of smoked goose, still warm from the hearth. It punches your taste buds, then gives you a peppery hug. And then, brace yourself. There's fermentation. Not just for beer and wine. Fermented sauces, preserved dairy, even fermented fish paste made appearances. In some corners of Europe, a stinky sauce made from decomposed fish, like ancient Roman garum, hung on in rustic forms. You hesitate at a jar labelled simply relish. You do not open it. More pleasant, preserved dairy. Hard cheeses were a godsend portable protein that kept for months. Some were mild, others could peel paint. You sample a wax-coated wheel aged for over a year. It's crumbly sharp and makes your eyebrows lift in surprise. Like Cheddar's grumpy great-uncle. Milk itself spoiled quickly within a day or two in summer, so folks turned it into buttermilk curds and cheese. Monks, of course, were cheese geniuses. They developed styles that still exist today. Ever had Munster thank a medieval monk? Outside, you're shown another trick: underground storage. Root cellars, cool springs, even snow pits lined with straw. They'd bury turnips and parsnips for months, dig them out midwinter, and stew them until edible, or at least until teeth could manage. You visit one such root cellar crouching through a doorway carved into the hillside. Inside, it's cool and damp, lined with baskets of carrots, beets, and knobby things that probably have names like skirret or salsify. You touch a parsnip. It's cold. It looks like it could survive the apocalypse. And guess what? It kinda did. The ingenuity doesn't stop there. You learn that some medieval people preserved eggs by coating them in lime water or ash. Others wrapped apples in straw and stored them in lofts. Grapes hung upside down on strings. Even pies were sometimes used for preservation, encased in thick, inedible crusts called coffins that sealed in the contents like a pastry sarcophagus. One such pie is on display. The crust is dense and hard as clay, but inside spiced venison with prunes and vinegar. You crack it open and take a cautious bite. It's dark, gamey, and kind of amazing, like a medieval meatball sub, but way more crumbly. You learn something else. Seasonal rhythms dictated everything. Spring meant fresh greens and dairy. Summer brought fruit, herbs, fish. Autumn was the great harvest and the biggest preserving season. Winter, that was survival mode. Cured meats, root vegetables, porridge with a side of just hang on, and sometimes even preserved food wasn't enough. Famine years struck when crops failed or wars disrupted supply. People resorted to foraging nettles, acorns, wild onions. In the worst times, flour was stretched with sawdust or ground bark. You shudder and thank your modern pantry. Still, you marvel at how much they achieved with so little. No timers, no temperature gauges, no sterile packaging, just intuition, experience, and a slightly terrifying willingness to experiment. You step outside sunlight warming your face after the cold cellars. A wheelbarrow rolls past piled with turnips and jugs of oil. Somewhere someone is smoking a pheasant over applewood. And from a nearby doorway wafts the unmistakable scent of pickled cabbage. You take it all in: the brine, the salt, the smoke. Medieval food wasn't just about survival. It was about adapting, stretching the seasons, turning scarcity into flavour, transforming the perishable into the enduring. You pluck a dried fig from your pouch, bite down, and feel the sun from 6 months ago. You rise slowly this time, stretching beneath scratchy wool as sunlight pours in through the slit of a window. It's been days of wandering through medieval kitchens, markets, monasteries, and memories. And somehow, despite everything you've seen and smelled, you're still hungry. Curious too, because while you've explored what people ate, how they preserved it, and who had access to what, there's one question lingering, like the scent of garlic on your tunic. How did food change you? Not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, culturally. Tonight you'll be dining in a different kind of hall, one where food becomes ritual identity and frankly control. Welcome to the dining habits of medieval religious fasts and feast days. Yes, you're about to sit at the ever-shifting table of the church calendar. You step into a village church just as the bell rings out for prime. The place is simple stone walls, wooden pews, the faint aroma of old wax and worn wood. But its influence, monumental. The church didn't just shape souls, it shaped appetites. You might have guessed medieval Europe was deeply religious. And that meant food followed a sacred schedule. Fasting wasn't just for Lent, it happened over 150 days a year, sometimes more. Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, the entire season of Advent, the days before feast days, saints' days. It's enough to make your stomach whimper. So what exactly did fasting mean? Not what you might think. It didn't always mean eating nothing, though some monks tried that. Fasting often meant no meat, no dairy, and no indulgence. Fish, grains, vegetables, and oil were fair game. Sometimes eggs were allowed, sometimes not. Historians still argue whether those exceptions were practical decisions or creative reinterpretations of spiritual intent. You're invited to sit at a table in a local home preparing for a Lenten meal. The family greets you warmly already, elbow deep in prep. There's barley bread baking on a stone onion simmering in olive oil, and a pie being filled not with meat but with ground almonds, raisins, and a splash of rosewater. Welcome to the art of making fasting food feel like feasting. The almond milk base mimics cream. The rosewater perfumes the filling like a soft hymn. There's no sugar, just honey, and even that is used sparingly. A pot of vegetable stew bubbles nearby, thick with leeks, turnips, and lentils. A bit bland, but filling. One of the daughters grins and hands you something odd-looking, a fake egg. It's an empty eggshell carefully filled with almond paste. It's an illusion. The yolk is saffron-tinted marzipan, the white a bland mash. You bite in. Sweet nutty, a little too clever for its own good. People got really creative with fast day meals. Faux roasts made from fish moulded into the shape of birds. Peas mashed and reformed into little loaves. Even fake cheese made from soaked bread and ground nuts. Of course, when the fast ended, the feasting began. Feast days were extravaganzas. Think roasted meat spice sauces, sweet pastries, and wine flowing like praise songs. You're lucky enough to witness one St. Michael's Day, or Michaelmas. A church holiday, yes, but also a massive culinary event. You join the villagers gathered on the green. A spit-roasted goose turns slowly over open flames, its scent rich and savoury. Tables grown with fresh bread plum tarts, herb-stuffed fish, and even a whole pig's head dressed in apples. It's theatrical, yes, but symbolic too, an offering of abundance, a reward for restraint. You watch children dart around with honey cakes, fingers sticky and eyes wide. Nearby, someone slices into a venison pie the size of a small cart. Laughter fills the air. A priest blesses the table. And for once, no one is worried about preservation or penance. Tonight is about joy, but the feast isn't just about indulgence, it's about belonging. The church calendar gave structure to the year and to people's stomachs. Fasting wasn't always easy, but it reminded everyone from peasants to kings of their place in the cosmic order, of humility, of patience. And then when the feast came, it was more than food, it was release. You're handed a cup of spiced wine. You sip. Cinnamon, clove, maybe nutmeg, a rare and expensive addition. And yes, Someone still has that medieval staple on the table, a peacock feathers reattached, posed like it's about to file a complaint. Fun fact, peacock wasn't all that tasty. Dry, gamey, more impressive than delicious. But it was a symbol of prestige, and on feast days, prestige mattered as much as palate. You take a small bite just to say you did. Yep, just as dry as advertised. Some records from noble households list up to 50 dishes served in a single feast. Servants paraded them in elaborate sequence, each more bizarre or symbolic than the last. Swans' boar's heads, even pies that released live birds when opened. Historians still debate whether that was cruelty, creativity, or both. After the roast goose and wine, you're treated to a rare gem, a slice of marchpane, a kind of marzipan cake sculpted into shapes. This one, a miniature castle with almond paste turrets and tiny flags. You bite into a tower. It's sweet, crumbly, and vaguely architectural. As the sky darkens and lanterns are lit, someone recites a prayer of thanks. The food is gone, or packed away to be munched in secret later, but the feeling lingers. Fullness. Not just in your belly, but in your spirit. Feasting wasn't just celebration. It was punctuation, a marker in the rhythm of life. You'd fast praise, sacrifice, and then rejoice. The food made you feel the contrast. It made the joy sharper. And in a way, that's what defined medieval eating more than any single dish. Not just what was served, but when. Not just how it tasted, but how it fit into the year, the ritual, the soul. You step away from the firelight, your cloak pulled tighter, your breath visible in the evening chill. Somewhere behind you, someone starts singing. A soft tune old as the land. You walk past baskets of leftover bread, a goose carcass stripped clean, a half-eaten marchpane wall. The feast will be remembered. The fast will return. And then another feast, another fast. It's all one long edible prayer. Your boots crunch over frosty grass as you make your way down the hill full belly, and drowsy thoughts weighing you like a warm blanket. You've wandered through so many tables now. Peasants, nobles, monks, cooks, even the weird, proud peacock parade, and you're starting to sense the rhythm of it all. Food in the medieval world wasn't static. It moved. It changed. It meant things. Tonight it's time to look at how that changed over time, and what ushered medieval food out of the shadows and into something a little more familiar. Because the medieval world didn't just end one day. It simmered, shifted, stirred by trade, travel, war weather, and whim, and slowly, subtly so did the food. You wander into a bustling port town, somewhere along the French coast. The docks are cluttered with barrels shouting merchants, and the sharp scent of fish and brine. Trade is thriving. It's the late 1400s now, and something's cooking literally and historically. You pass crates of pepper sacks of rice, bundles of saffron wrapped in oilcloth like they're precious relics. And they are. Spices once rare enough to buy a cow with a fistful are becoming more accessible. Not cheap exactly, but within reach for wealthier households and occasionally well-off tradesfolk. It's changing the game. You stop at a tavern where a young cook is preparing something intriguing, a pigeon pie with dates, cinnamon ginger, and a splash of orange blossom water. A little medieval, a little Renaissance, a lot delicious. You take a bite and realize it tastes both ancient and surprisingly modern, sweet, savory, rich. Trade with the East by land and increasingly by sea brought new flavors into Europe. Rice, citrus, almonds, sugar, and with the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the rise of Italian city-states, new routes opened. The Mediterranean became a culinary highway. Spices flowed, recipes travelled, and people's expectations changed. Historians still argue whether the average European peasant ever got a real taste of these luxury imports, or if they just heard about them from sweaty monks and travelling merchants. Probably a bit of both. But the idea of flavour was growing more adventurous. You overhear a couple of sailors talking about something called cacao, a bitter drink from across the ocean. They describe it as weird, dark, invigorating. You blink. Is that chocolate? Not yet. But the seeds are there, literally. You walk on passing a woman stirring a bubbling pot of thick syrup. It's sugar boiled with almonds being poured onto a slab to cool. Confectioners were becoming a thing now, not just bakers, but artists of sweetness. Sugar, once a rare medical additive, is now the crown jewel of dessert. And with it come candies, syrups, and slowly gingerbread. Not the soft cookie-cutter kind. Medieval gingerbread was sticky spiced and dense as memory foam. Made with breadcrumbs, honey, pepper, and ginger, it was shaped into tiny sculptures, hearts, shields, lions. Some were dipped in gold leaf. You try a piece. It's chewy, pungent, and oddly regal. And what about cookbooks, believe it or not? They're starting to appear, not for the peasants, of course, but for noble households. Instructions written in thick script, mostly in Latin or early French, listing complex multi-stage recipes. You glance at one. Take capon, clean him well. Boil with clove and mace, thicken with bread, add egg yolks beaten with verjuice. It's not a checklist, it's a challenge. These recipes were less about feeding and more about flaunting. But even among common folk, things were shifting. The little flour mill now runs more efficiently. Bread ovens are more widespread. Farmers are rotating crops more smartly. Diets are diversifying just a bit. Not a food revolution, but a quiet reshuffling. Then there's another factor you can't ignore: war. The 100 Years' War, the Crusades. The rise of gunpowder and mercenaries all meant more movement. Soldiers travelled. Armies fed themselves off the land or through rations. And with them came food, traditions, seeds, and habits. A Norman soldier might bring back a taste for garlic. An English archer might crave leeks like the Welsh. And then plague. You pass through a village where the houses sit crooked and quiet. The air feels heavy. The Black Death changed everything. Not just populations, but economies and diets. Fewer people meant more available land, more wages. Some former peasants started eating like minor lords, meat more than once a week, even eggs in their stew. But it also meant trauma, fear. People turned to food as comfort medicine and ritual. Certain spices were believed to ward off sickness. Bread made with particular grains was thought to be cleaner. Vinegar was used as a wash. Superstition met survival in the kitchen. Historians still debate how drastically the plague changed medieval food habits long term. But the psychological impact, that's harder to measure, and maybe more important. You eat differently after surviving a plague, more reverently, or maybe just more hungrily. You continue down the road where you hear music from an inn. The food smells familiar now: hearty stews, spiced pies, even something fried. Fried, yes, frying is catching on. Fat, once too precious to waste, is now used more liberally. You try a fritter. It's a little greasy but sweet and warm. There's laughter, cards, music. The tavern crowd is diverse: merchants, scribes, farmers, even a student. And they're all eating versions of the same dish: porridge, bread, meat, ale. The basics, but better than before. And then across the threshold of time, you step into an early Renaissance kitchen. It's cleaner, better lit. The hearth is wider, the ingredients more varied. There's a sense of curiosity. A cook adds parsley not because he has to, but because he wants to. A recipe includes lemon zest. Someone sprinkles sugar on fruit just because it sparkles. You watch it happen, this slow transformation. Food becoming something more than sustenance. Something close to pleasure, choice, art. And just like that, the world is tipping forward toward the early modern age. Tomatoes and potatoes are still years away. Chocolate, coffee and tea haven't hit breakfast tables yet, but the doors are opening. You take one last walk through a twilight market. Vendors sell spiced cakes, preserved fruit, dried fish and fragrant herbs. You spot a monk buying ginger, a child with a honey biscuit, a merchant slicing cold roast beef with mustard seeds. It's the Middle Ages still, but not for much longer. You pause, look back. From acorns and turnips to saffron and almond milk, from survival stews to spice peacock, you've tasted 1,000 lives. You've felt the rhythms of hunger, The joy of feasting, the sorrow of scarcity, and the magic of persistence. And as the sun sets, as the church bell rings, you realize this wasn't a story about bad food. It was a story about people figuring things out one smoky kitchen at a time. The winds drop to a whisper now as you step through the final doorway. You're not in a banquet hall anymore, or a smoky peasant hut, or even the bustling kitchens of a monastery. You're somewhere quiet still, and a little warmer than before. The fire crackles low. The hearth is swept. And outside the moon hovers like a watching eye. This is the final course. Your journey through medieval food has been long chewy, sometimes sour, often strange. But tonight, you reflect not just on what people ate, but on why it mattered. Why it still matters. Because medieval food wasn't just bad, or even good. It was a mirror. You sit down beside a heavy wooden table, the kind that's seen centuries of elbows and tears and spilled broth, and you look across it, not at bread or pottage, but at the people who built history with spoons and sieves, peasants who survived winter on dried beans and stale rye, monks who turned fasting into culinary invention, cooks who crafted peacocks into fireworks, traders who risked storms for saffron, mothers who boiled barley with herbs and whispered prayers. Every single one of them left fingerprints on your plate. You reach out and touch the table. It's scarred, cracked, but solid. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly malnourished or just different, whether they hated their food or honoured it, whether their recipes were rooted in taste or theology. But maybe that's the point. There wasn't one medieval cuisine. There was 1,000. What made it seem bad to us wasn't always the flavour, it was the fear of scarcity, of rot, of illness, and behind every meal a shadow of crop failure, famine, or plague. You close your eyes and remember the feel of grain sacks slung across a market mule, the scent of leeks crushed with garlic, the salty tang of dried herring, the sweet crunch of almond candies, the oily, smoke-rich bite of roast goose. Food as memory, food as survival, food as faith. There's a myth we tell ourselves that people in the past didn't know better, that their food was crude, tasteless, grotesque. But maybe it's us who've forgotten how to taste the hunger behind the meal, the resourcefulness, the quiet pride in making something from almost nothing. You breathe out slow and deep, letting the scents of centuries settle in the room like incense. One last bite, a soft little tart made with cheese honey, and time passes your lips. It's simple, a bit odd, but comforting. The table fades, the fire glows low, your body sinks into softness and your mind quiets. This is where the story ends, not with a recipe, but with a recognition that food is history's most intimate echo. You've heard it, felt it, tasted it, and now you can rest. Let your shoulders drop now. Just like that. Let the last fire-lit images dim into soft shadows. You've walked a long winding road through muddy fields and crowded kitchens across banquet halls and into crumbling monasteries. You've listened to the crackle of roasting meats, the chop of knives on worn wooden boards, the gentle simmer of stews rich with meaning. Every meal you've imagined, every bite you've tasted in your mind's quiet kitchen has brought you a little closer to the heartbeat of history. So now let your breath ease into rhythm. In and out, slowly, easily. You're full not just in your belly, but in your thoughts. Maybe a little sleepy, maybe a little grateful, because somehow that long ago world of strange stews and fast days, dried fish and forgotten spices doesn't feel so distant now. It feels human, familiar, like a bedtime story told by a candle. Let your mind wander back to the warmth of the hearth, the soft flicker of firelight playing on stone walls, the hum of voices fading into the stillness of night. There's no need to remember every odd dish or quirky fact. Just let the feeling settle, the quiet curiosity, the gentle wonder, the comfort of knowing people long ago sat down to dinner with hopes and worries not so different from yours. Let that thought lull you deeper, Let the weight of time cradle you. Let the last traces of saffron, smoke and honey slip from your thoughts like a dream. And when you wake again, may your world feel just a little richer, a little slower, a little sweeter. Sleep well, traveller. End of script. Sweet dreams.